Chapter 44 of Falkner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beth Blakely, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Falkner by Mary Shelley. Chapter 44. Elizabeth listened in silence. All that had passed made a deep impression, from the moment that the solicitor had expressed a wish that Falkner had a zealous friend to cross the Atlantic, till now, that he himself dilated on the good that would result from representations being clearly and fervently made to Osborne. She was revolving an idea that absorbed her whole faculties. This idea was no other than going to America herself. She had no doubt that seeing Osborne she could persuade him, and the difficulties of the journey appeared slight to her who had travelled so much. She asked Falkner many questions, and his answers confirmed her more and more in her plan. No objection presented itself to her mind. Already she felt sure of success. There was scarcely time, it was true, for the voyage, but she hoped that the trial might be again deferred, if reasonable hopes were held out of Osborne's ultimate arrival. It was painful to leave Falkner without a friend, but the object of her journey was paramount even to this consideration. But it should be undertaken. Still, she said nothing of her scheme, and Falkner could not guess at what was passing in her mind. Wrapped in the reverie suggested by such a plan, she returned home in the evening, without thinking of the apparition of Neville, which had so filled her mind in the morning. It was not till at her own door that the thought glanced through her mind, and she remembered she had seen nothing of him. She looked across the open space where he had stood the evening before. It was entirely vacant. She felt disappointed and saddened, and she began to reflect on her total friendlessness. No one to aid her in preparations for her voyage, none to advise. Her sole resource was in hirelings, but her independent, firm spirit quickly threw off this weakness, and she began a note to Mr. Colville, asking him to call on her, as she wished to arrange everything definitively before she spoke to Falkner. As she wrote, she heard a rapid, decided step in her quiet street, followed by a hurried yet gentle knock at her door. She started up. "It is he!" The words were on her lips when Gerard entered. She held out her hand, gladness thrilling through her whole frame, her heart throbbing wildly, her eyes lighted up with joy. "This is indeed kind," she cried. "Oh, Mr. Neville, how happy your visit makes me!" He did not look happy. He had grown paler and thinner, and the melancholy which had sat on his countenance before, banished for a time by her, had returned, with the addition of a look of wildness that reminded her of the youth of Baden. Elizabeth was shocked to remark these traces of suffering, and her next impulse was to ask, "What has happened? I fear some new misfortune has occurred." "It is the property of misfortune to be ever new," he replied, "to be always producing fresh and more miserable results. I have no right to press my feelings on you. Your burden is sufficient. But I could not refrain any longer from seeing in what way adversity had exerted its pernicious influence over you." His manner was gloomy and agitated. She, resigned, devoted to her duties, commanding herself day by day to fulfill her task of patience, and of acquiring cheerfulness for Falkner's sake. She imagined that some fresh disaster must be the occasion of these marks of emotion. She did not know that fruitless struggles to alleviate the ills of her situation, vain broodings over its horrors, and bitter regret at losing her had robbed him of sleep, of appetite, of all repose. "I despise myself for my weakness," he said, "when I see your fortitude. You are more than woman, more than human being ever was, and you must feel the utmost contempt for one whom fortune bends and breaks as it does me. You are well, however, and half my dreams of misery have been false and vain. God guards and preserves you. I ought to have placed more faith in him. But tell me, dear Mr. Neville, tell me what has happened." "Nothing," he replied. "And does not that imply the worst? I cannot make up my mind to endure the visitation of ill fallen upon us. It drives me from place to place like an unlaid ghost. I am very selfish to speak in this manner, yet it is your sufferings that fill my mind to bursting. Were all the evil poured on my own head, while you were spared, welcome, most welcome, would be the bitterest infliction. But you, Elizabeth, you are my cruel father's victim, and the future will be more hideous than the hideous present." Elizabeth was shocked and surprised. What could he mean? "The future," she replied, "will bring my dear father's liberation. How then can that be so bad?" He looked earnestly and inquiringly on her. "Yes," she continued, "my sorrows, heavy as they are, have not that additional pang. I have no doubt of the ultimate justice that will be rendered my father. We have much to endure in the interim, much that undermines the fortitude and visits the heart with sickening throes. There is no help but patience. Let us have patience, and this adversity will pass away. The prison and the trial will be over, and freedom and security again be ours." "I see how it is," replied Neville. "We each live in a world of our own, and it is wicked in me to give you a glimpse of the scene as it is presented to me." "Yet speak, explain," said Elizabeth. "You have frightened me so much that any explanation must be better than the thoughts which your words, your manner suggest." "Nay," said Neville, "do not let my follies infect you. Your views, your hopes are doubtless founded on a reason. It is, if you will forgive the allusion that may seem too light for so sad a subject, but the old story of the silver and brazen shield. I see the dark, the fearful side of things. I live among your enemies, that is, the enemies of Mr. Falkner. I hear of nothing but his guilt, and the expiation prepared for it. I am maddened by all I hear. I have implored my father not to pursue his vengeance. Convinced as I am of the truth of Mr. Falkner's narration, the idea that one so gifted should be made over to the fate that awaits him is abhorrent. And when I think that you were involved in such a scene of wrong and horror, my blood freezes in my veins. I have implored my father, I have quarreled with him. I have made Sophia advocate the cause of justice against malice. All in vain. Could you see the old man, my father I mean, pardon my irreverence, how he revels in the demoniacal hope of revenge, and with what hideous delight he gloats upon the detail of ignominy to be inflicted on one so much his superior in every noble quality, you would feel the loathing I do. He heaps sarcasm and contempt on my feeble spirit, as he names my pardon of my mother's destroyer, my esteem for him, and my sympathy for you. But that does not touch me. It is the knowledge that he will succeed, and you will be lost and miserable forever, that drives me to desperation. I fancied that these thoughts must pursue you even more painfully than they do me. I saw you writhing beneath the tortures of despair, wasting away under the influence of intense misery. You haunted my dreams, accompanied by every image of horror. Sometimes you were bleeding, ghastly dying. Sometimes you took my poor mother's form, as Falkner describes it, snatched cold and pale from the waves. Other visions flitted by, still more frightful. Despairing of moving my father, abhorring the society of every human being, I have been living for the last month at Dromore. A few days ago my father arrived there. I wondered till I heard the cause. The time for expecting Osborne had arrived. As vultures have instinct for carrion, so he swooped down at the far-off scent of evil fortune. He had an emissary at Liverpool, on the watch, to hear of this man's arrival. Disgusted at this foul appetite for evil, I left him. I came here only to see you, to gaze on you afar, to purify the world of the blasts from hell, which the bad passions I have so long contemplated spread round me. My father learned whither I had gone. I had a letter from him this morning, you may guess at its contents. He triumphs in Osborne's refusal to appear, said Elizabeth, who was much moved by the picture of hatred and malice Neville had presented to her, and trembled from head to foot as she listened, from the violent emotions his account excited, and the vehemence of his manner as he spoke. He does indeed triumph, replied Neville. And you and your Mr. Falkner do not despair? If you could see my dear father, said Elizabeth, her courage returning at the thought, you would see how innocence and a noble mind can sustain. At the worst, he does not despair. He bears the present with fortitude. He looks to the future with resignation. His soul is firm, his spirit inflexible. And you share these feelings? Partly I do, and partly I have other thoughts to support me. Osborne's cowardice is a grievous blow, but it must be remedied. The man we sent to bring him was too easily discouraged. Other means must be tried. I shall go to America, I shall see Osborne, and you cannot doubt of my success. You? Cried Neville. You go to America? You to follow the traces of a man who hides himself? Impossible! This is worse madness than all. Does Falkner consent to so senseless an expedition? You use strong expressions, interrupted Elizabeth. I do, he replied, and I have a right to do so. I beg your pardon, but my meaning is justifiable. You must not undertake this voyage. It is as useless as improper. Suppose yourself arrived on the shores of wide America. You seek a man who conceals himself. You know not where. Can you perambulate large cities? Cross wide extents of country? Go from town to town in search of him? It is my personal exertion alone that he can be found, and your age and sex wholly prevent that. Yet I shall go, said Elizabeth thoughtfully. So much is left undone, because we fancy it impossible to do, which upon endeavour is found plain and easy. If insurmountable obstacles oppose themselves, I must submit, but I see none yet. I have not the common fears of a person whose life has been spent in one spot. I've been a traveller, and know that, but for the fatigue, it is as easy to go 1,000 miles as 100. If there are dangers and difficulties, they will appear light to me, encountered for my dear father's sake. She looked beautiful as an angel as she spoke. Her independent spirit had nothing rough in its texture. It did not arise from a love of opposition, but from a belief that in fulfilling a duty she could not be opposed or injured. Her fearlessness was that of a generous heart that could not believe in evil intentions. She explained more fully to her friend the reasons that induced her determination. She repeated Falkner's account of Osborne's character, the injury that it was believed would arise from his refusal to appear, and the probable facility of persuading him, were he addressed by one zealous in the cause. Neville listened attentively. She paused. He was lost in thought and made no reply. She continued to speak, but he continued mute, till at last she said, "You are conquered. I know, you yield, and agree that my journey is a duty, a necessity." "We are both apt, it would seem," he replied, "to see our duties in a strong light, and to make sudden, or they may be called rash, resolutions. Perhaps we both go too far, and are in consequence reprehended by those about us. In each other, then, let us find approval. You must not go to America, for your going would be useless. With all your zeal you could not succeed. But I will go. Of course this act will be treated as madness or worse by Sir Boyville and the rest, but my own mind assures me that I do right. For many years I devoted myself to discovering my mother's fate. I have discovered it. Falkner's narrative tells all, but clear and satisfactory as that is to me, others choose to cast frightful doubts over its truth, and conjure up images the most revolting. Have they any foundation? I do not believe it, but many do, and all assert that the approaching trial alone can establish the truth. This trial is but a mockery, unless it is fair and complete. It cannot be that without Osborne. Surely then it neither misbecomes me as her son, nor as the son of Sir Boyville, to undertake any action that will tend to clear up the mystery. I am resolved I shall go. Be assured that I shall not return without Osborne. You will allow me to take your place, to act for you. You do not distrust my zeal." Elizabeth had regarded her own resolves as the simple dictates of reason and duty, but her heart was deeply touched by Neville's offer. Tears rushed into her eyes as she replied, in a voice faltering with emotion, "I fear this cannot be. It will meet with too much opposition. But never, never can I repay your generosity in but imagining so great a service." "It is a service to both," he said. "And as to the opposition I shall meet, that is my affair. You know that nothing will stop me when once resolved, and I am resolved. The inner voice that cannot be mistaken assures me that I do right. I ask no other approval. A sense of justice, perhaps of compassion, for the original author of all our wretchedness, ought probably to move me, but I will not pretend to be better than I am. Were Falkner alone concerned, I fear I should be lukewarm. But not one cloud, nor the shadow of a cloud, shall rest on my mother's fate. All shall be clear, all universally acknowledged, nor shall your life be blotted, and your heart broken by the wretched fate of him to whom you cling with matchless fidelity. He is innocent, I know, but if the world thinks and acts by him as a murderer, how could you look up again? Through you I succeeded in my task. To you I owe unspeakable gratitude, which it is my duty to repay. Yet away with such expressions. You know that my desire to serve you is boundless, that I love you beyond expression, that every injury you receive is trebled upon me, that vain were every effort of self-command. I must do that thing that will benefit you, though the whole world rose to forbid. You are of more worth in your innocence and nobleness than a nation of men such as my father. Do you think I can hesitate in my determinations thus founded, thus impelled?" More vehement, more impassioned than Elizabeth, Neville bore down her objections, while he awakened all her tenderness and gratitude. "Now I prove myself your friend," he said proudly. "Now heaven affords me opportunity to serve you, and I thank it." He looked so happy, so wildly delighted, while a more still but not less earnest sense of joy filled her heart. They were young, and they loved. This of itself was bliss, but the cruel circumstances around them added to their happiness by drawing them closer together, and giving fervor and confidence to their attachment. And now that he saw a mode of serving her, and she felt entire reliance on his efforts, the last veil and barrier fell from between them, and their hearts became united by that perfect love which can result alone from entire confidence and acknowledged, unshackled sympathy. Always actuated by generous impulses, but often rash in his determinations and impetuous in their fulfillment, full of the warmest sensibility, hating that the meanest thing that breathed should endure pain, and feeling the most poignant sympathy for all suffering, Neville had been maddened by his own thoughts, while he brooded over the position in which Elizabeth was placed. Not one of those various circumstances that alleviate disaster to those who endure it presented themselves to his imagination. He saw adversity in its most hideous form, without relief or disguise. Names and images appending to Falkner's frightful lot, which he and Elizabeth carefully banished from their thoughts, haunted him. The fate of the basest felon hung over the prisoner. Neville believed that it must inevitably fall on him. He often wondered that he did not contrive to escape, that Elizabeth, devoted and heroic, did not contrive some means of throwing open his dungeon's doors. He had endeavored to open his father's eyes, to soften his heart, in vain. He had exerted himself to discover whether any trace of long-past circumstances existed that might tend to acquit Falkner. He had gone to Treby, visited the graves of the hapless parents of Elizabeth, seen Mrs. Baker, and gathered there the account of his landing. But nothing helped to elucidate the mystery of his mother's death. Faulkner's own account was the only trace left behind that bore the stamp of truth in every line, and appeared to him so honorable a tribute to poor Alethea's memory, that he looked with disgust on his father's endeavors to cast upon it suspicions and interpretations the most hideous and appalling. In the first instance, he had been bewildered by Sir Boyvill's sophistry, and half conquered by his plausible arguments. But a short time, and the very circumstance of Elizabeth's fidelity to his cause, sufficed to show him the baseness of his motives, and the real injury he did his mother's fame. Resolved to clear the minds of other men from the prejudice against the prisoner thus spread abroad, and at least to secure a fair trial, Neville made no secret of his belief that Falkner was innocent. He represented him everywhere as a gentleman, a man of humanity and honor, whose crime ought to receive its punishment from his own conscience, and at the hand of the husband or son of the victim in the field, and whom to pursue as his father did was at once futile and disgraceful. Sir Boyville, irritated by Falkner's narrative, his vanity wounded to the quick by the avowed indifference of his wife, was enraged beyond all bounds by the opposition of his son. Unable to understand his generous nature, and relying on his previous zeal for his mother's case, he had not doubted but that his revenge would find a ready ally in him. His present arguments, his esteem for their enemy, his desire that he should be treated with a forbearance which between gentlemen was but an adherence to the code of honor, appeared to Sir Boyville insanity, and worse, a weakness the most despicable, a want of resentment the most low-minded. But he cared not. The game was in his hands. Reveling in the idea of his enemy's ignominious sufferings, he more than half persuaded himself that his accusation was true, and that the punishment of a convicted felon would at last satisfy his thirst for revenge. A feeble old man, tottering on the verge of the grave, he gloried to think that his grasp was still deadly, his power acknowledged in throes of agony by him by whom he had been injured. Returning to Dromore from Carlisle, Gerard sought his father. Osborne's refusal to appear crowned Sir Boyville's utmost hopes, and his sarcastic congratulations when he saw his son expressed all the malice of his heart. Gerard replied with composure that he did indeed fear that this circumstance would prove fatal to the course of justice, but that it must not tamely be submitted to, and that he himself was going to America to induce Osborne to come, that nothing might be wanting to elucidate the mystery of his mother's fate, and to render the coming trial full, fair, and satisfactory. Such an announcement rendered for a moment Sir Boyville speechless with rage. A violent scene ensued. Gerard, resolved and satisfied of the propriety of his resolution, was calm and firm. Sir Boyville, habituated to the use of vituperative expressions, boiled over with angry denunciations and epithets of abuse. He called his son the disgrace of his family, the opprobrium of mankind, the detractor of his mother's fame. Gerard smiled, yet at heart he deeply felt the misery of thus for ever finding an opponent in his father, and it required all the enthusiasm and passion of his nature to banish the humiliating and saddening influence of Sir Boyville's indignation. They parted worse friends than ever. Sir Boyville set out for town. Gerard repaired to Liverpool. The wind was contrary. There was little hope of change. He thought that it would conduce to his success in America if he spent the necessary interval in seeing Hoskins again, and also in consulting with his friend, the American minister. So in all haste, having first secured his passage on board a vessel that was to sail in 4 or 5 days, he also set out for London. End of chapter 44. Recording by Beth Blakely. Chapter 45 of Falkner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beth Blakely, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Falkner by Mary Shelley, Chapter 45. The philosophy of Falkner was not proof against the intelligence that Gerald Neville was about to undertake the voyage to America for the sake of inducing Osborne to come over. Elizabeth acquainted him with her design, and her friend's determination to replace her with sparkling eyes and cheeks flushed by the agitation of pleasure, the pure pleasure of having such proof of the worth of him she loved. Falkner was even more deeply touched, even though he felt humiliated by the very generosity that filled him with admiration. His blood was stirred and his feelings tortured him by a sense of his own demerits, and the excellence of one he had injured. "Better die without a word than purchase my life thus," were the words hovering on his lips. Yet it was no base cost that he paid, and he could only rejoice at the virtues of the son of her whom he had so passionately loved. There are moments when the past is remembered with intolerable agony, and when to alter events, which occurred at the distance of many years, becomes a passion and a thirst. His regret at Alethea's marriage seemed all renewed. His agony that thenceforth she was not to be the half of his existence, as he had hoped, that her child was not his child, that her daily life, her present pleasures, and future hopes were divorced from his. All these feelings were revived, together with a burning jealousy, as if instead of being a buried corpse, she had still adorned her home with her loveliness and virtues. Such thoughts lost their poignancy by degrees, and he could charm Elizabeth by dwelling on Gerard's praises, and he remarked with pleasure that she resumed her vivacity and recovered the color and elasticity of motion which she had lost. She did not feel less for Falkner, but her contemplations had lost their sombre hue. They were full of Neville, his voyage, his exertions, his success, his return, and the spirit of love that animated each of these acts were gone over and over again in her waking dreams. Unbidden smiles gleamed in her countenance. Her ideas were gaily colored, and her conversation gained a variety and cheerfulness that lightened the burden of their prison hours. Meanwhile Neville arrived in London. He visited the American minister, and learned from him that Osborne had given up the place he held, and had left Washington. No one knew whither he was gone, these events being still too recent to leave any trace behind. It was evident that to seek and find him would be a work of trouble and time, and Neville felt that not a moment must be lost. December was drawing to a close. The voyages to and from America might, if not favorable, consume the whole interval that still remained before the spring assizes. Hoskins, he learned, was gone to Liverpool. He visited Lady Cecil before he left town. Though somewhat tainted by worldliness, yet this very feeling made her highly disapprove Sir Boyvill's conduct. A plausible, and she believed, true account was given of Mrs. Neville's death, exonerating her, redounding indeed to her honour. It was injurious to all to cast doubts upon this tale. It was vulgar and base to pursue revenge with such malicious and cruel pertinacity. Falkner was a gentleman, and deserved to be treated as such, and now he and Elizabeth were mixed up in loathsome scenes and details that made Lady Cecil shudder even to think of. That Gerard should go to America as the advocate, as it were, of Falkner, startled her, but he represented his voyage in a simpler light, as not being undertaken for his benefit, but for the sake of justice and truth. Sir Boyville came in upon them while they were discussing this measure. He was absolutely frenzied by his son's conduct and views. His exasperation but tended to disgust, and did not operate to shake their opinions. Neville hastened back to Liverpool. A southwest wind reigned, whose violence prevented any vessel from sailing for America. It was evident that the passage would be long, and perhaps hazardous. Neville thought only of the delay, but this made him anxious. A portion of his time was spent in seeking for Hoskins, but he was not to be found. At last it was notified to him that the wind had a little changed, and that the packet was about to sail. He hurried on board. Soon they were tossing on a tempestuous sea. They lost sight of land, sky and ocean each dusky, and the one rising at each moment into more tumultuous commotion surrounded them. Neville, supporting himself by a rope, looked out over the horizon. A few months before he had anticipated the same voyage over a summer sea. Now he went under far other auspices. The veil was raised, the mystery explained, but the wintry storms that had gathered round him were but types of the tempestuous passions which the discoveries he had made raised in the hearts of all. For 3 days and nights the vessel beat about in the Irish Channel, unable to make any way. 3 days were thus lost to their voyage, and when were they to arrive? Impatient, almost terrified by the delay which attended his endeavours, Neville began to despair of success. On the 4th night the gale rose to a hurricane. There was no choice but to run before it. By noon the following day the captain thought himself very lucky to make the harbour of Liverpool, and though the gale had much abated, and the wind had veered into a more favourable quarter, it was necessary to run in to refit. With bitter feelings of disappointment, Neville disembarked, Several days must elapse before the packet would be able to put to sea, so he abandoned the idea of going by her, and finding a New York merchantman preparing to sail at an early hour the following morning, he resolved to take his passage on board. He hastened to the American coffee house to see the captain and make the necessary arrangements for his voyage. The captain had just left the tavern, but a waiter came up to Neville and told him that the Mr. Hoskins, concerning whom he had before inquired, was in the house, in a private room. "Show me to him," said Neville, and followed the man as he went to announce him. Hoskins was not alone. He had a friend with him, and they were seated over their wine on each side of the fire. Neville could not help being struck with the confusion evinced by both as he entered. The person with Hoskins was a fair, light-haired, rather good-looking man, though past the prime of life. He had at once an expression of good nature and cunning in his face, and added to this a timid, baffled look, which grew into something very like dismay when the waiter announced Mr. Neville. "Good morning, sir," said Hoskins. "I hear that you have been inquiring for me. I thought all our business was settled." "On your side, probably," replied Neville. "On mine, I have reasons for wishing to see you. I have been seeking you in vain in London and here." "Yes, I know," said the other. "I went round by Ravenglass to take leave of the old woman before I crossed, and here I am, my passage taken, with not an hour to lose. I sail by the Audiobooks, Captain Bateman." "Then we shall have time enough for all my inquiries," observed Neville. "I came here for the very purpose of arranging my passage with Captain Bateman." "You, sir, are going to America? I thought that was all at an end." "It is more necessary than ever. I must see Osborne. I must bring him over. His testimony is necessary to clear up the mystery that hangs over my mother's fate." "You are nearer hanging Mr. Falkner without him than with him," said Hoskins. "I would bring him over for the very purpose of saving a man whom I believe to be innocent of the crime he is charged with. For that purpose I go to America. I wish the truth to be established. I have no desire for revenge." "And do you really go to America for that purpose?" repeated Hoskins. "Certainly. I consider it my duty," replied Neville. "Nay, it may be said that I went for this design, for I sailed by the John Adams, which has been driven back by the contrary winds. I disembarked only half an hour ago." "That beats all," cried Hoskins. "Why, do you know, I have more than half a mind to tell you, you had really sailed for America for the purpose of bringing Osborne over, and you now intend taking a passage on board for the Audiobooks?" "Certainly, why not? What is there so strange in all this? I sought you for the sake of making inquiries that might guide me in my search for Osborne, who wishes to conceal himself." "You could not have addressed a better man. By the Lord, he's a craven, and deserves no better. So I'll just let out, Mr. Neville, that Osborne sneaked out of this room at the instant he saw you come into it." Neville had seen Hoskins' companion disappear. He thought it but an act of civility. The strangeness of this coincidence, the course of events at once so contrary and so propitious, staggered him for a moment. "They tell of the rattlesnake," said Hoskins, "that fixing its eye on its prey, a bird becomes fascinated, and wheels round nearer and nearer till he falls into the jaws of the enemy. Poor Osborne, he wishes himself on the shores of the Pacific, to be far enough off, and here he is, and turn and twist as he will, it will end by the law grasping him by the shoulder, and dragging him to the very noose he so fears to slip into. Not that he helped to murder the lady. You do not believe that, Mr. Neville? You do not think that the lady was murdered?" "I would stake my existence that she was not," said Neville. "Were it otherwise, I should have no desire to see Osborne or to interfere. Strange, most strange it is, that he should be here. And he is come, you think, with no design of offering his testimony to clear Mr. Falkner?" "He is come under a feigned name," replied Hoskins. "Under pretense that he was sent by Osborne. He has brought a quantity of attested declarations, and hopes to serve Mr. Falkner without endangering his own neck. It was even so. Osborne was a weak man, good-hearted, as it is called, but a craven. No sooner did he hear that Hilary had sailed for Europe, and that he might consider himself safe, than he grew uneasy on another score. He had still possession, even while he had denied all knowledge of the writer, of Falkner's letter, representing to him the necessity of coming over. It was simply but forcibly written. Every word went to the heart of Osborne. Now that he believed that his conduct would make over his generous benefactor to an ignominious end, this idea haunted him like an unlaid ghost. Yet if they hanged Falkner, what should prevent them from hanging him too? Suspicion must fall equally on both. When Hilary had urged the case, many other objections had presented themselves to Osborne's mind. He thought of the new honest course he had pursued so long, the honorable station he had gained, the independence and respectability of his present life, and he shrunk from giving up these advantages and becoming again, in all men's eyes, the Osborne whose rascality he had left behind in England. It seemed hard that he should feel the weight of the chain that bound his former existence to his present one, when he fondly hoped that time had broken it. But these minor considerations vanished as soon as the idea of Falkner's danger fastened itself on his mind. It is always easy to fall back upon a state of being which once was ours. The uncertain, disreputable life Osborne had once led, he had gladly bidden adieu to, but the traces were still there, and he could fall into the way of it without any great shock. Besides this, he knew that Hilary had made his coming, and the cause of it, known to the legal authorities in Washington, and though he might persist in his denials, still he felt that he should be universally disbelieved. A dislike at being questioned and looked askance upon by his American friends made him already turn his eyes westward. A longing to see the old country arose unbidden in his heart. Above all, he could neither rest nor sleep nor eat, nor perform any of the offices of life, for the haunting image of his benefactor, left by him to die a felon's death. Not that he felt tempted to alter his determination, and to come forward to save him. On the contrary, his blood grew chill, and his flesh shrunk at the thought. But still he might conceal himself in England. No one would suspect him of being there. He would be on the spot to watch the course of events, and if it was supposed that he could render any assistance without compromising himself, he should at least be able to judge fairly how far he might concede. His vacillating mind could go no further in its conclusions. Hoskins had rightly compared him to the bird and the rattlesnake. He was fascinated. He could not avoid drawing nearer and nearer to the danger which he believed to be yawning to swallow him. 10 days after Hilary left America, he was crossing the Atlantic. Hoskins was the first person he saw on landing. The second was Neville. His heart grew cold. He felt himself in the toils. How bitterly he repented his voyage. Coward as he was, he died 1,000 deaths from fear of that one which, in fact, there was no danger of his incurring. That Osborne should of his own accord have come to England appeared to smooth everything. Neville did not doubt that he should be able to persuade him to come forward at the right time. He instructed Hoskins to reassure him, and to induce him to see him, and if he objected, to contrive that they should meet. He promised to take no measures for securing his person, but to leave him in all liberty to act as he chose. He depended that the same uneasy conscience that brought him from America to Liverpool would induce him at last, after various throes and struggles, to act as it was supposed he would have done at the beginning. But day after day passed, and Osborne was not to be found. Hoskins had never seen him again, and it was impossible to say whither he was gone or where he was hid. The Anew, whose voyage had again been delayed by contrary winds, now sailed. Hoskins went with her. It was possible that Osborne might be on board, returning to the land of refuge. Neville saw the captain, and he denied having such a passenger, but he might be bound to secrecy, or Osborne might have disguised himself. Neville went on board. He carefully examined each person. He questioned both crew and passengers. He even bribed the sailors to inform him if anyone were secreted. The Anew was not, however, the only vessel sailing. Nearly 30 packets and merchantmen, who had been detained by foul winds, were but waiting for a tide to carry them out. Neville deliberated whether he should not apply to a magistrate for a search warrant. He was averse to this, nay repugnant. It was of the first importance to the utility of Osborne as a witness, that he should surrender himself voluntarily. The seizing him by force, as an accomplice in the murder, would only place him beside Falkner in the dock, and render his evidence of no avail, and his, Neville's, causing his arrest, could only be regarded as a piece of rancorous hostility against the accused. Yet to suffer him to depart from the English shores was madness, and worse still, to be left in doubt of whether he had gone or remained. If the first were ascertained, Neville could take his passage also, and there might still be time to bring him back. When we act for another, we are far more liable to hesitation than when our deeds regard ourselves only. We dread to appear lukewarm. We dread to mar all by officiousness. Ill success always appears a fault, and yet we dare not make a bold venture, such as we should not hesitate upon, were it our own case. Neville felt certain that Falkner would not himself deliberate, but risk all to possess himself of the person of Osborne. Still he dared not take so perilous, perhaps so fatal, a step. The tide rose, and the various docks filled. One by one the American-bound vessels dropped out and put to sea. It was a moment of agony to Neville to see their sails unfurl, swell to the wind, and make a speedy and distant offing. He now began to accuse himself bitterly of neglect. He believed that there was but one mode of redeeming his fault, to hurry on board one of the packets, and to arrive in America as soon as Osborne, whom he felt convinced was already on his way thither. Swift in his convictions, rash in execution, uncertainty was peculiarly hostile to his nature, and these moments of vacillation and doubt, and then of self-reproach at having lost all in consequence, were the most painful of his life. To determine to do something was some consolation, and now he resolved on his voyage. He hurried back to his hotel for a few necessaries and money. On his entrance, a letter was put into his hands. The contents changed the whole current of his ideas. His countenance cleared up. The tumult of his thoughts subsided into a happy calm. Changing all his plans, instead of undertaking a voyage to America, he the same evening set out for London. End of chapter 45. Recording by Beth Blakely.
Chapter 46 of Falkner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Falkner by Mary Shelley. Chapter 46. The prisoner and his faithful companion knew nothing of these momentous changes. Day by day, Elizabeth withdrew from the fire to the only window in her father's room, moving her embroidery table close to it. Her eyes turned, however, to the sky, instead of to the flowers she was working, and leaning her cheek upon her hand, she perpetually watched the clouds. Gerard was already, she fancied, on the waste of waters, yet the clouds did not change their direction. They all sped one way, and that contrary to his destination. Thus she passed her mornings, and when she returned to her own abode, where her heart could more entirely spend its thoughts on her lover and his voyage, her lonely room was no longer lonely, nor the gloomy season any longer gloomy. More than happy, a breathless rapture quickened the beatings of her heart, as she told over again and again Neville's virtues, and, dearer than all, his claims on her gratitude. Falkner saw with pleasure the natural effects of love and hope add to the cheerfulness of his beloved child, diffuse a soft charm over her person, her motions, and her voice, and impart a playful tenderness to her before rather serious manners. Youth, love, and happiness are so very beautiful in their conjunction. God grant, he thought, I do not mar this fair creature's life. May she be happier than Alethea. If man can be worthy of her, Gerald Neville surely is. As he turned his eyes silently from the book that apparently occupied him, and contemplated her pensive countenance, whose expression showed that she was wrapped in, yet enjoying her thoughts, retrospect made him sad. He went over his own life, its clouded morning, the glad beams that broke out to dissipate those clouds, and the final setting amid tempests and wreck. Was all life like this? Must all be disappointed hope, baffled desires, lofty imaginations, engendering fatal acts, and bringing the proud thus low? Would she at his age view life as he did, a weary wilderness, a tangled, endless labyrinth, leading by one rough path or another to a bitter end? He hoped not. Her innocence must receive other reward from heaven. It was on a day as they were thus occupied, Falkner refrained from interrupting Elizabeth's reverie, which he felt was sweeter to her than any converse, and appeared absorbed in reading. Suddenly she exclaimed, "The wind has changed, dear father. Indeed it has changed. It is favorable now. Do you not feel how much colder it is? The wind has got to the north. There is a little east in it. His voyage will not be a long one if this change only lasts." Falkner answered her by a smile, but it was humiliating to think of the object of that voyage, and her cheerful voice announcing that it was to be prosperous struck, he knew not why, a saddening chord. At this moment he heard the bolts of the chamber door pushed back, and the key turn in the lock. The turnkey entered, followed by another man, who hesitated as he came forward, and then, as he glanced at the inhabitants of the room, drew back, saying, "There is some mistake. Mr. Falkner is not here." But for his habitual self-command, Falkner had started up, and made an exclamation, so surprised was he to behold the person who entered, for he recognized his visitant on the instant. He himself was far more changed by the course of years. Time, sickness, and remorse had used other than Praxitelean art, and had defaced the lines of grace and power which had marked him many years ago, before his hands had dug Alethea's grave. He was indeed surprised to see who entered, but he showed no sign of wonder, only saying with a calm smile, "No, there is no mistake. I am the man you seek." The other now apparently recognized him, and advanced timidly and in confusion. The turnkey left them, and Falkner then said, "Osborne, you deserve my thanks for this, but I did believe that it would come to this." "No," said Osborne, "I do not deserve thanks. And he looked confused, and glanced towards Elizabeth. Falkner followed his eye, and understanding his look, said, "You do not fear being betrayed by a lady, Osborne. You are safe here as in America. I see how it is. You are here under a false name. No one is aware that you are the man who, a few weeks ago, refused to appear to save a fellow creature from death." "I see no way to do that now," replied Osborne hesitatingly. "I do not come for that. I could not stay away. I thought something might be done." "Elizabeth, my love," said Falkner, "you at least will thank Mr. Osborne for his spontaneous services. You are watching the clouds which were to bear along the vessel towards him, and beyond our hopes he is already here." Elizabeth listened breathlessly. She feared to utter a word, lest it should prove a dream. Now, gathering Falkner's meaning, she came forward, and with all a woman's grace addressed the trembling man, who already looked at the door as if he longed to be on the other side, fearful that he was caught in his own toils. For, as Hoskins said, the fascinated prey had wheeled yet nearer to his fate involuntarily. He had been unable to resist his desire to see Falkner and learn how it was with him. But he still resolved not to risk anything. He had represented himself to the magistrates as coming from Osborne, showing false papers, and a declaration drawn up by him at Washington, and attested before official men there, setting forth Falkner's innocence. He had brought this over to see if it would serve his benefactor, and had thus got access to him. Such was his reliance on the honor of his patron, that he had not hesitated in placing himself in his power, well aware that he should not be detained by him against his will. For still his heart quailed, and his soul shrunk from rendering him the service that would save his life. His manner revealed his thoughts to the observant Falkner. But Elizabeth, less well read in men's hearts, younger and more sanguine, saw in his arrival the completion of her hopes, and she thanked him with so much warmth, and with such heartfelt praises of his kindness and generosity, that Osborne began to think that his greatest difficulty would be in resisting her fascination and disappointing her wishes. He stammered out at last some lame excuses. All he could do consistently with safety, they might command. He had shown this by coming over. More could not be asked, could not be expected. He himself, God knew, was innocent. So was Mr. Falkner of the crime he was charged with. But he had no hand whatever in the transaction. He was not in his confidence. He had not known even who the lady was. His testimony, after all, must be worth nothing, for he had nothing to tell, and for this he was to expose himself to disgrace and death. Acquiring courage at the sound of his own voice, Osborne grew fluent. Elizabeth drew back. She looked anxiously at Falkner, and saw a cloud of displeasure and scorn gather over his countenance. She put her hand on his, as if to check the outbreak of his indignation. Yet she herself, as Osborne went on, turned her eyes flashing with disdain upon him. The miserable fellow cowed before the glances of both. He shifted from one foot to the other. He dared not look up. But he knew that their eyes were on him, and he felt the beams transfix him and wither up his soul. There are weak men who yield to persuasion. There are weaker who are vanquished by reproaches and contempt. Of such was Osborne. His fluency faded into broken accents. His voice died away. As a last effort, he moved towards the door. "Enough, sir," said Falkner in a calm, contemptuous voice. "And now be gone. Hasten away. Do not stop till you have gained the shore, the ship, the waves of the Atlantic. Be assured I shall not send for you a second time. I have no desire to owe my life to you." "If I could save your life, Mr. Falkner," he began, "but—" "We will not argue that point," interrupted Falkner. "It is enough that it is generally asserted that your testimony is necessary for my preservation. Were my crime as great as it is said to be, it would find its punishment in that humiliation. Go, sir. You are safe. I would not advise you to loiter here. Return to America. Walls have ears in abodes like these. You may be forced to save a fellow creature against your will. Hasten then away. Go. Eat, drink, and be merry. Whatever betides me, not even my ghost shall haunt you. Meanwhile, I would beg you no longer to insult me by your presence. Begone at once." "You are angry, sir," said Osborne timidly. "I hope not," replied Falkner, who had indeed felt his indignation rise, and checked himself. "I should be very sorry to feel anger against a coward. I pity you. You will repent this when too late?" "Oh, do not say so!" cried Elizabeth. "Do not say he will repent when too late. But now, in time, I am sure that he repents. Do you not, Mr. Osborne? You are told that your fears are vain. You know Mr. Falkner is far too noble to draw you into danger to save himself. You know even that he does not fear death, but ignominy, eternal, horrible disgrace. And the end, the frightful end prepared, even he must recoil from that. And you— No, you cannot in cold blood and with calm forethought make him over to it. You cannot. I see that you cannot." "Forbear, Elizabeth," interrupted Falkner in a tone of displeasure. "I will not have my life, nor even my honor, begged by you. Let the worst come, the condemnation, the hangman. I can bear all, except the degradation of supplicating such a man as that." "I see how it is," said Osborne. "Yes, you do with me as you will. I feared this. And yet I thought myself firm. Do with me as you will. Call the jailer. I will surrender myself." He turned pale as death and tottered to a chair. Falkner turned his back on him. "Go, sir," he repeated. "I reject your sacrifice." "No, father, no!" cried Elizabeth eagerly. "Say not so. You accept it, and I also, with thanks and gratitude. Yet it is no sacrifice, Mr. Osborne. I assure you that it is not. At least the sacrifice you fear. All is far easier than you think. There is no prison for you. Your arrival need not yet be known. Your consent being obtained, a pardon will be at once granted. You are to appear as a witness, not as a—" Her voice faltered. She turned to Falkner, her eyes brimming over with tears. Osborne caught the infection. He was touched. He was cheered also by Elizabeth's assurances, which he hoped that he might believe. Hitherto he had been too frightened and bewildered to hear accurately even what he had been told. He fancied that he must be tried. The pardon might or might not come afterward. The youth, earnestness, and winning beauty of Elizabeth moved him. And now that his fears were a little allayed, he could see more clearly. He was even more touched by the appearance of his former benefactor. Dignity and yet endurance, suffering as well as fortitude, marked his traits. There was something so innately noble, and yet so broken by fortune, expressed in his commanding yet attenuated features and person. He was a wreck that spoke so plainly of the glorious being he had once been. There was so much majesty in his decay, such real innocence sat on his high and open brow, streaked though it was with disease, such lofty composure in his countenance, pale from confinement and suffering, that Osborne felt a mixture of respect and pity that soon rose above every other feeling. Reassured with regard to himself, and looking on his patron with eyes that caught the infection of Elizabeth's tears, he came forward. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Falkner," he said, "for my doubts, for my cowardice, if you please so to name it. I request you to forget it, and to permit me to come forward in your behalf. I trust you will not disdain my offer, though late it comes, I assure you, from my heart." There was no mock dignity about Falkner. A sunny smile broke over his features as he held out his hand to Osborne. "And from my heart I thank you," he replied, "and deeply regret that you are to suffer any pain through me. Mine was the crime, you the instrument. It is hard, very hard, that you should be brought to this through your complaisance to me. Real danger for you there is none, or I would die this worse death rather than expose you to it." Elizabeth now, in all gladness, wrote a hasty note, desiring Mr. Colville to come to them, that all might at once be arranged. "And Gerard, dear father," she said, "we must write to Mr. Neville, to recall him from his far and fruitless journey." "Mr. Neville is in Liverpool," said Osborne. "I saw him the very day before I came away. He doubtless was on the lookout for me, and I dare swear Hoskins betrayed me. We must be on our guard." "Fear nothing from Mr. Neville," replied Elizabeth. "He is too good and generous not to advocate justice and truth. He is convinced of my father's innocence." They were interrupted. The solicitor entered. Osborne's appearance was beyond his hopes. He could not believe in so much good fortune. He had begun to doubt, suspect, and fear. He speedily carried off his godson, as he named him, to talk over and bring into form his evidence, and all that appertained to his surrender, thus leaving Falkner with his adopted child. Such a moment repaid for much. For Elizabeth's hopes were high, and she knelt before Falkner, embracing his knees, thanking heaven in a rapture of gratitude. He also was thankful, yet mortification and wounded pride struggled in his heart with a sense of gratitude for unhoped-for preservation. His haughty spirit rebelled against the obligation he owed to so mean a man as Osborne. It required hours of meditation, of reawakened remorse for Alethea's fate, of renewed wishes that she should be vindicated before all the world, of remembered love for the devoted girl at his feet, to bring him back from the tumult of contending passions to the fortitude and humility which he at every moment strove to cultivate. Elizabeth's sweet voice dispelled such storms, and rewarded him for the serenity he had last regained. It was impossible not to feel sympathy in her happiness, and joy in possessing the affection of so gentle, yet so courageous and faithful a heart. Elizabeth's happiness was even more complete when she left him, and sat in her solitary room, there where Gerard had so lately visited her, and his image and her gratitude towards him mingled more with her thoughts. Her last act that night was to write to him, to tell him what had happened. It was her note that he received at Liverpool on the eve of his second departure, and which had changed his purpose. He had immediately set out for London to communicate the good tidings to Lady Cecil. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of Falkner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Falkner by Mary Shelley. Chapter 47. These had been hours of sunshine for the prisoner and his child, such as seldom visit the precincts of a jail. And soon, too, they changed, and the usual gloom returned to the abode of suffering. In misfortune various moods assail us. At first we are struck, stunned, and overwhelmed. Then the elastic spirit rises. It tries to shape misery in its own way. It adapts itself to it. It finds unknown consolations arise out of circumstances which, in moments of prosperity, were unregarded. But this temper of mind is not formed for endurance. As a sick person finds comfort in a new posture at first, but after a time the posture becomes restrained and wearisome. Thus, after mustering fortitude, patience, the calm spirit of philosophy, and the tender one of piety, and finding relief, suddenly the heart rebels. Its old desires and old habits recur, and we are the more dissatisfied from being disappointed in those modes of support in which we trusted. There was a perpetual struggle in Falkner's heart, hatred of life, pride, a yearning for liberty, and a sore, quick spirit of impatience for all the bars and forms that stood between him and it, swelled like a tide in his soul. He hated himself for having brought himself thus low. He was angry that he had exposed Elizabeth to such a scene. He reviled his enemies in his heart. He accused destiny. Then again, if he but shut his eyes, the stormy river, the desolate sands, and the one fair being dead at his feet, presented themselves, and remorse like a wind drove back the flood. He felt that he had deserved it all, that he had himself woven the chain of circumstances which he called his fate, while his innocence of the crime brought against him imparted a lofty spirit of fortitude and even of repose. Elizabeth, with an angel's love, watched the changes of his temper. Her sensibility was often wounded by his sufferings, but her benign disposition was so fertile of compassion and forbearance that her own mood was never irritated by finding her attempts to console fruitless. She listened meekly when his overladen heart spent itself in invectives against the whole system of life. Or, catching a favorable moment, she strove to raise his mind to nobler and purer thoughts, unobtrusive but never weary, eagerly gathering all good tidings, banishing the ill. Her smiles, her tears, her cheerfulness or calm sadness by turns relieved and comforted him. Winter came upon them. It was wild and drear. Their abode, far in the north of the island, was cold beyond their experience. The dark prison walls were whitened by snow. The bars of their windows were laden. Falkner looked out. The snow drifted against his face. One peep at the dusky sky was all that was allowed him. He thought of the wide steppes of Russia, the swift sledges, and how he longed for freedom. Elizabeth, as she walked home through the frost and sleet, gave a sigh for the soft seasons of Greece, and felt that a double winter gathered round her steps. Day by day time passed on. Each evening, returning to her solitary fireside, she thought, "Another is gone, the time draws near." She shuddered, despite her conviction that the trial would be the signal for the liberation of Falkner. She saw the barriers time had placed between him and fate fall off one by one with terror. January and February passed. March had come. The 1st of March, the very month when all was to be decided, arrived. Poor tempest-tossed voyagers! Would the wished-for port be gained? Should they ever exchange the uncertain element of danger for the firm land of security? It was on the 1st of March that, returning home in the evening, she found a letter on her table from Neville. Poor Elizabeth! She loved with tenderness and passion, and yet how few of the fairy thoughts and visions of love had been hers! Love with her was mingled, and with so dire a tragedy, such real oppressive griefs, that its charms seemed crimes against her benefactor. Yet now, as she looked on the letter and thought, "From him," the rapture of love stole over her. Her eyes were dimmed by the agitation of delight, and the knowledge that she was loved suspended every pain, filling her with soft triumph and thrilling though vague expectation. She broke the seal. There was an inner envelope directed to Miss Raby, and she smiled at the mere thought of the pleasure Gerard must have felt in tracing that name, the seal, as he regarded it, of their future union. But when she unfolded the sheet and glanced down the page, her attention was riveted by other emotions. Thus Neville wrote: My own sweet Elizabeth, I write in haste, but doubt is so painful, and tidings fly so quickly, that I hope you will hear first, by means of these lines, the new blow fate has prepared for us. My father lies dangerously ill. This, I fear, will again delay the trial, occasion prolonged imprisonment, and keep you still a martyr to those duties you so courageously fulfill. We must have patience. We are impotent to turn aside irrevocable decrees. Yet, when we think how much hangs on the present moment of time, the heart, my weak heart at least, is wrung by anguish. I cannot tell whether Sir Boyvill is aware of his situation. He is too much oppressed by illness for conversation. The sole desire he testifies is to have me near him. Once or twice he has pressed my hand and looked on me with affection. I never remember to have received before such testimonials of paternal love. Such is the force of the natural tie between us, that I am deeply moved, and would not leave him for the whole world. My poor father! He has no friend, no relative but me, and now, after so much haughtiness and disdain, he, in his need, is like a little child, reduced to feel his only support in natural affections. His unwonted gentleness subdues my soul. Oh, who would rule by power, when so much more absolute a tyranny is established through love? Sophia is very kind, but she is not his child. The hour approaches when we should be at Carlisle. What will be the result of our absence? What the event of this illness? I am perplexed and agitated beyond measure. In a day or two all will be decided. If Sir Boyvill becomes convalescent, still it may be long before he can undertake so distant a journey. Do not fear that for a moment I shall neglect your interests. They are my own. For months I have lived only on the expectation of the hour when you should be liberated from the horrors of your present position, and the anticipation of another delay is torture. Even your courage must sink, your patience have an end. Yet a little longer, my Elizabeth, support yourself. Let not your noble heart fail at this last hour, this last attack of adversity. Be all that you have ever been, firm, resigned, and generous. In your excellence I place all my trust. I will write again very speedily, and if you can imagine any service that I can do you, command me to the utmost. I write by my father's bedside. He does not sleep, but he is still. Farewell, I love you. In those words is summed a life of weal or woe for me and for you also, my Elizabeth. Do not call me selfish for feeling thus, even here. Yes, yes, thought Elizabeth, busy fingers are weaving. The web of destiny is unrolling fast. We may not think, nor hope, nor scarcely breathe. We must await the hour. Death is doing his work. What victim will he select? The intelligence in this letter, communicated on the morrow to all concerned in the coming trial, filled each with anxiety. In a very few days the assizes would commence. Falkner's name stood first on the list. Delay was bitter, yet he must prepare for delay, and arm himself anew with resolution. Several anxious days passed. Elizabeth received no other letter. She felt that Sir Boyvill's danger was protracted, that Gerard was still in uncertainty. The post hour now became a moment of hope and dread. It was a sort of harassing inquietude, hard to endure. At length a few lines from Lady Cecil arrived. They brought no comfort. All remained in the same state. The assizes began. On the morrow the judges were expected in Carlisle, and already all that bustle commenced that bore the semblance of gaiety in the rest of the town, but which was so mournful and fearful in the jail. There were several capital cases. As Elizabeth heard them discussed, her blood ran cold. She hated life and all its adjuncts. To know of misery she could not alleviate was always saddening, but to feel the squalid, mortal misery of such a place and hour brought home to her own heart was a wretchedness beyond all expression, poignant and hideous. The day that the judges arrived, Elizabeth presented herself in Falkner's cell, a letter in her hand. Her first words announced good tidings. Yet she was agitated, tearful. Something strange and awful had surely betided. It was a letter from Neville that she held, and gave to Falkner to read. I shall soon be in Carlisle, my dearest friend, but this letter will outspeed me, and bring you the first intelligence of my poor father's death. Thank God I did my duty by him to the last. Thank God he died in peace with me and the whole world. The uneasiness of pain yielded at first to torpor, and thus we feared he would die. But before his death he recovered himself an hour or two, and though languid and feeble, his mind was clear. How little, dear Elizabeth, do we know of our fellow creatures, each shrouded in the cloak of manner. That cloak of various dyes displays little of the naked man within. We thought my father vain, selfish, and cruel. He was all this, but he was something else that we knew not of. He was generous, humane, humble. These qualities he hid as if they had been vices. He struggled with them. Pride prevented him from recognizing them as the redeeming points of a faulty nature. He despised himself for feeling them until he was on his deathbed. Then, in broken accents, he asked me, his only son, to pardon his mistakes and cruelties. He asked me to forgive him in my dear mother's name. He acknowledged his injustices towards her. Would that I might live, he said, for my awakened conscience urges me to repair a portion of the evils I have caused. But it is too late. Strange that I should never have given ear to the whisperings of justice, though they were often audible, till now, when there is no help. Yet is it so? Cannot some reparation be made? There is one. And as he spoke, he half raised himself, and some of the wonted fire flashed from his glazed eye. But he sunk back again, saying in a low but distinct voice, Falkner, Rupert Falkner, he is innocent. I know and feel his innocence, yet I have striven to bring him to the death. Let me record my belief that his tale is true, and that Alethea died the victim of her own heroism, not by his hand. Gerard, remember, report these words, save him. His sufferings have been great. Promise me, that I may feel that God and Alethea will forgive me, as I forgive him. I act now as your mother would have had me act. I act to please her. I speak it without shame. My eyes ran over with tears, and this softening of a proud heart before the remembered excellence of one so long dead, so long thought of with harshness and resentment, was the very triumph of the good spirit of the world. Yet tears were all the thanks I could give for several minutes. He saw that I was moved, but his strength was fast leaving him, and pressing my hand and murmuring, My last duty is now performed. I will sleep. He turned away his head. He never spoke more, except to articulate my name. And once or twice, as his lips moved, and I bent down to listen, I heard the name of my mother breathed at the latest hour. I cannot write more. The trial will take place, I am told, immediately before the funeral. I shall be in Carlisle. All will go well, dear Elizabeth, and when we meet again, happier feelings will be ours. God bless you now and always, as you deserve. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of Falkner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Falkner by Mary Shelley. Chapter 48. All things now assumed an anxious aspect. All was hurrying to a conclusion. Tomorrow the trial was to come on. Security is not a word for mortal man to use, more especially when the issue of an event depends on the opinions and actions of his fellow creatures. Falkner's acquittal was probable, but not certain. Even if the impression went in general in his favor, a single juryman might hold out, and perverseness adding to obstinacy would turn the scale against him. Sickening fears crept over Elizabeth's heart. She endeavored to conceal them. She endeavored to smile and repeat, "This is our last day of bondage." Falkner cast no thought upon the worst. Innocence shut out fear. He could not look forward to the ignominy of such a trial without acute suffering. Yet there was an austere composure in his countenance that spoke of fortitude and reliance on a power beyond the limit of human influence. His turn had come to encourage Elizabeth. There was a nobleness and simplicity of character common to both that made them very intelligible to each other. Falkner, however, had long been nourishing secret thoughts and plans, of which he had made no mention till now, the crisis impending, he thought it best to lift a portion of the veil that covered the future. "Yes," he said, in reply to Elizabeth, "tomorrow will be the last day of slavery. I regain my human privileges after tomorrow, and I shall not be slow to avail myself of them. My first act will be to quit this country. I have never trod its soil but to find misery. After tomorrow I leave it forever." Elizabeth started and looked inquiringly. Were her wishes, her destiny, to have no influence over his plans? He knew of the hope, the affection that rendered England dear to her. Falkner took her hand. "You will join me hereafter, dearest. But you will, in the first instance, yield to my request, and consent to a separation for a time." "Never," said Elizabeth. "You cannot deceive me. You act thus for my purposes, and not your own, and you misconceive everything. We will never part." "Daughters, when they marry," observed Falkner, "leave father, mother, all, and follow the fortunes of their husbands. You must submit to the common law of human society." "Do not ask me to reason with you and refute your arguments," replied Elizabeth. "Our position is different from that of any other parent and child. I will not say I owe you more than daughter ever owed father. Perhaps the sacred tie of blood may stand in place of the obligations you have heaped on me. But I will not reason. I cannot leave you. Right or wrong in the eyes of others, my own heart would perpetually reproach me. I should image your solitary wanderings, your lonely hours of sickness and suffering, and my peace of mind would be destroyed." "It is true," said Falkner, "that I am more friendless than most men. Yet I am not so weak and womanish that I need perpetual support. Your society is dear to me, dearer God, who reads my heart, knows, than liberty or life. I shall return to that society, and again enjoy it. But for a time do not fear but that I can form such transitory ties as will prevent solitary suffering. Men and women abound who will feel benevolently towards the lonely stranger. Money purchases respect. Blameless manners win kindness. I shall find friends in my need if I desire it, and I shall return at last to you." "My dearest father," said Elizabeth, "you cannot deceive me. I penetrate your motives, but you wholly mistake. You would force me also to mistake your character, but I know you too well. You never form transitory friendships. You take no pleasure in the ordinary run of human intercourse. You inquire, you seek for instruction, you endeavor to confer benefits, but you have no happiness except such as you derive from your heart, and that is not easily impressed. Did you not for many long years continue faithful to one idea, Adhere to one image, devote yourself to one only, despite all that separated you? Did not the impediment you found to the fulfillment of your visions blight your whole life and bring you here? Pardon me if I allude to these things. I cannot be to you what she was, but you can no more banish me from your heart and imagination than you could her. I know that you cannot. We are not parent and child, she continued playfully, but we have a strong resemblance on one point. Fidelity is our characteristic. We will not speak of this to others. They might think that we boasted. I am not quite sure that it is not a defect, at least in some cases, as with you it proved a misfortune. To me it can never be such. It repays itself. I cannot leave you, whatever befalls. If Gerald Neville is hereafter lost to me, I cannot help it. It would kill me to fall off from you. I must follow the natural, the irresistible bent of my character. Tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, we will speak more of this. What is necessary for your happiness, be assured, I will fulfill without repining. But now, dearest father, let us not speak of the future now. My heart is too full of the present. The future appears to me a dream never to be arrived at. Oh, how more than blessed I shall be when the future, the long future, shall grow into interest and importance. They were interrupted. One person came in, and then another, and the appalling details of the morrow effectually banished all thoughts of plans, the necessity of which Falkner wished to impress on his young companion. He also was obliged to give himself up to present cares. He received all, he talked to all, with a serious but unembarrassed air, while Elizabeth sat shuddering by, wiping away her tears unseen, and turning her dimmed eyes from one to the other, pale and miserable. We have fortitude and resignation for ourselves, but when those beloved are in peril, we can only weep and pray. Sheltered in a dusky corner, a little retreated behind Falkner, she watched, she listened to all, and her heart almost broke. Leave him? After this leave him, she thought, a prey to such memories. Oh, may all good angels desert me when I become so vile a wretch. The hour came when they must part. She was not to see him on the morrow until the trial was over, for her presence during the preliminary scenes was neither fitting nor practicable. Already great indulgences had been granted to the prisoner, arising from his peculiar position, the great length of time since the supposed crime had been committed, and the impression now become general that he was innocent. But this had limits. The morrow was to decide all, and send him forth free and guiltless, or doom him to all the horrors of condemnation and final suffering. Their parting was solemn. Neither indulged in grief. Falkner felt composed. Elizabeth endeavored to assume tranquillity, but her lips quivered, and she could not speak. It was like separating, not to meet for years. A few short hours, and she would look again upon his face, but how much would happen in the interval? How mighty a change have occurred? What agony would both have gone through, the one picturing, the other enduring the scene of the morrow, the gaze of thousands, the accusation, the evidence, the defense, the verdict, each of these bearing with it, to the well-born and refined, a barbed dart, pregnant with thrilling poison, ignominy added to danger. How Elizabeth longed to express to the assembled world the honor in which she held him, whom all looked on as overwhelmed with disgrace. How she yearned to declare the glory she took in the ties that bound them, and the affection that she bore. She must be mute, but she felt all this to bursting, and her last words, best of men, excellent, upright, noble, generous, God will preserve you and restore you to me, expressed in some degree the swelling emotions of her soul. They parted. Night and silence gathered round Falkner's pillow. With stoical firmness he banished retrospect, he banished care. He laid his hopes and fears at the feet of that almighty power, who holds earth and all it contains in the hollow of his hand, and he would trouble himself no more concerning the inevitable, though unknown decree. His thoughts were at first solemn and calm, and then, as the human mind can never, even in torture, fix itself unalterably on one point, milder and more pleasing reveries presented themselves. He thought of himself as a wild, yet not worthless schoolboy. He remembered the cottage porch, clustered over with odoriferous parasites, under whose shadow sat the sick, pale lady, with her starry eyes and wise lessons, and her radiant daughter, whose soft hand he held as they both nestled close at her feet. He recalled his wanderings with that daughter over hill and dale, when their steps were light, and their hearts unburdened with a care, soared to that heaven which her blessed spirit had already reached. Oh, what is life, that these dreams of youth and innocence should have conducted her to an untimely grave, him to a felon's cell! The thought came with a sharp pang. Again he banished it, and the land of Greece, his perils, and his wanderings with Elizabeth on the shores of Zante, now replaced his other memories. He then bore a burden on his heart, which veiled with dark crape the glories of a sunny climate, the heart-cheering tenderness of his adopted child. This was less bitter, this meeting of fate, this atonement. Sleep crept over him at last, and such is the force of innocence, that though a cloud of agony hung over his awakening, yet he slept peacefully on the eve of his trial. Towards morning his sleep became less tranquil. He moved, he groaned. Then opening his eyes, he started up, struggling to attain full consciousness of where he was, and wherefore. He had been dreaming, and he asked himself what had been the subject of his dreams. Was it Greece, or the dreary waste shores of Cumberland? And why did that fair lingering shape beckon him? Was it Alethea or Elizabeth? Before these confused doubts could be solved, he recognized the walls of the cell, and saw the shadow of the bars of his windows on the curtains spread before it. It was morning, the morning, where would another sun find him? He rose and drew aside the curtain, and there were the dark high walls, weather-stained and huge. Clear but sunless daylight was spread over each object. It penetrated every nook, and yet was devoid of cheer. There is indeed something inexpressibly desolate in the sight of the early, gray, chill dawn, dissipating the shadows of night, when the day which it harbingers is to bring misery. Night is a cloak, a shelter, a defense. All men sleep at night. The law sleeps, and its dread ministrants are harmless in their beds, hushed like cradled children. Even now they sleep, thought Falkner, pillowed and curtained in luxury. But day is come, and they will soon resume their offices, and drag me before them. And wherefore? Because it is day, because it is Wednesday, because names have been given to portions of time which otherwise might be passed over and forgotten. To the surgeon's eye, a human body sometimes presents itself merely as a mass of bones, muscles, and arteries, though that human body may contain a soul, to emulate Shakespeare. And thus there are moments when the wretched dissect the forms of life, and contemplating only the outward semblance of events, wonder how so much power of misery, or the reverse, resides in what is after all but sleeping or waking, walking here or walking there, seeing one fellow creature instead of another. Such were the morbid sensations that absorbed Falkner as day grew clearer and clearer, the narrow court more gloomy as compared with the sky, and the objects in his cell assumed their natural color and appearances. All asleep, he again thought, except I, the sufferer. And does my own Elizabeth sleep? Heaven grant it, and guard her slumbers. May those dear eyes long remain closed in peace upon this miserable day. He dressed himself long before anyone in the prison, and jailers are early risers, was awake. At last there were steps in the passage, bolts were drawn, and voices heard. These familiar sounds recalled him to actual life and approaching inevitable events. His haughty soul awoke again. A dogged pride steeled his heart. He remembered the accusation, the execration in which he believed himself to be held, and his innocence. Retribution or atonement, I am ready to pay it, as it is demanded of me for Alethea's sake. But the injustice of man is not lessened on this account. Henceforth I am to be stamped with ignominy. And yet in what am I worse than my fellows? At least they shall not see that my spirit bends before them. He assumed cheerfulness, and bore all the preliminaries of preparation with apparent carelessness. Sometimes his eagle eye flashed fire, sometimes fixed on vacancy. A whole life of memories passed across his mental vision. But there was no haste, no trepidation, no faltering. He never thought of danger or of death. Innocence sustained him. The ignominy of the present was all that he felt that he had to endure and master. That and the desolation beyond, when branded through life as he believed he should be. Even by acquittal he was henceforth to be looked on as an outcast. At length he was led forth to trial, pride in his heart, resolution in his eye. He passed out of the gloomy portal of the prison, and entered the sunlit street. Houses were around, but through an opening he caught a glimpse of the country. Uplands and lawny fields and tree-crested hills, the work of God himself. Sunshine rested on the scene. One used to liberty had regarded with contempt the restricted view presented by the opening. But to the prisoner, who for months had only seen his prison walls, it seemed as if the creation lay unrolled in its majesty before him. What was man in comparison with the power that upheld the earth and bade the sun to shine? And man was to judge him? What mockery! Man and all his works were but a plaything in the hands of omnipotence, and to that Falkner submitted his destiny. He rose above the degrading circumstances around him. He looked down upon his fate. A real, a lofty calm at last possessed his soul. He felt that naught said or done that day by his fellow creatures could move him. His reliance was elsewhere. It rested on his own innocence, and his intimate sense that he was in no more danger now than if sheltered in the farthest, darkest retreat, unknown to man. He walked as if surrounded by an atmosphere which no storms from without could penetrate. He entered the court with a serene brow, and so much dignity added to a look that expressed such entire peace of conscience, that everyone who beheld him became prepossessed in his favor. His distinct calm voice declaring himself not guilty, the confidence, untinged by vaunting, with which he uttered the customary appeal to God and his country, excited admiration at first, and then, when a second sentiment could be felt, the most heart-moving pity. Such a man, so unstained by vice, so raised above crime, had never stood there before. Accustomed to the sight of vulgar rogues or hardened ruffians, wonder was mingled with a certain self-examination, which made each man feel that, if justice were done, he probably deserved more to be in that dock than the prisoner. And then they remembered that he stood there to be consigned to life or death, as the jury should decide. A breathless interest was awakened, not only in the spectators, but even in those hardened by habit to scenes like this. Every customary act of the court was accompanied by a solemnity unfelt before. The feeling, indeed, that reigned was something more than solemn. Thirsting curiosity and eager wonder gave way before thrilling awe, to think that that man might be condemned to an ignominious end. When once the trial had begun, and his preliminary part had been played, Falkner sat down. He became, to all appearance, abstracted. He was, indeed, thinking of things more painful than even the present scene, the screams and struggles of the agonized Alethea, her last sad sleep in the hut upon the shore, the strangling, turbid waves, her wet, lifeless form, her low, unnamed grave dug by him, Had those been atoned for by long years of remorse and misery, or was the present ignominy and worse that might ensue fitting punishment? Be it as it might, he was equal to the severest blows, and ready to lay down a life in compensation for that of which he, most unintentionally and yet most cruelly, had deprived her. His thoughts were not recalled to the present scene till a voice struck his ear, so like hers. Did the dead speak? Knit up as he was to the endurance of all, he trembled from head to foot. He had been so far away from that place, till the echo, as it were, of Alethea's voice recalled him. In a moment he recovered himself, and found that it was her child, Gerald Neville, who was giving his evidence. He heard the son of his victim speak of him as innocent, and a thrill of thankfulness entered his soul. He smiled, and hope and sympathy with his fellow creatures, and natural softening feelings, replaced the gloomy bitterness and harshness of his past reflections. He felt that he should be acquitted, and that it became him to impress all present favorably. It became him to conduct himself so as to show his confidence in the justice of those on whom his fate depended, and at once to assert the dignity of innocence. From that time he gave himself entirely up to the details of the trial. He became attentive, and not the less calm and resolute, because he believed that his own exertions would crown the hour with success. The spectators saw the change in him, and were roused to double interest. The court clock, meanwhile, kept measure of the time that passed. The hands traveled silently on. Another turn, and all would be over. And what would then be? End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of Falkner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Falkner by Mary Shelley. Chapter 49. Elizabeth, meanwhile, might envy the resolution that bore him through these appalling scenes. On the night after leaving him, she had not even attempted to rest. Wrapped in a shawl, she threw herself on a sofa, and told each hour during the livelong night. Her reveries were wild, vague, and exquisitely painful. In the morning she tried to recall her faculties. She remembered her conviction that on that day Falkner would be liberated, and she dressed herself with care, that she might welcome him with the appearances of rejoicing. She expected with unconquerable trepidation the hour when the court would meet. Before that hour there was a knock at her door, and a visitor was announced. It was Mrs. Raby. It was indeed a solace to see a friendly face of her own sex. She had been so long deprived of this natural support. Lady Cecil had now and then written to her. Her letters were always affectionate, but she seemed stunned by the magnitude of the blow that had fallen on her friend, and unable to proffer consolation. With kindness of heart, sweetness of temper, and much good sense, still Lady Cecil was commonplace and worldly. Mrs. Raby was of a higher order of being. She saw things too exclusively through one medium, and thus the scope of her exertions was narrowed. But that medium was a pure and elevated one. In visiting Elizabeth on this occasion, she soared beyond it. Long and heavily had her desertion of the generous girl weighed on her conscience. She could sympathize in her heroism, and warmly approve. It was in her nature to praise and to reward merit, and she had withheld all tribute from her abandoned niece. The interests of her religion, blended with those of family, actuated her, and while resisting a natural impulse of generosity, she fancied that she was doing right. She had spoken concerning her with no one but Lady Cecil, and she, while she praised her young friend, forgot to speak of Falkner, and there lay the stumbling block to every motion in her favor. When Elizabeth repaired to Carlisle, Mrs. Raby returned to Belforest. She scarcely knew how to introduce the subject to her father-in-law, and when she did, he, verging into dotage, only said, "Act as you please, my dear, I rely on you. Act for the honor and welfare of yourself and your children." The old man day by day lost his powers of memory and reason. By the time of the trial he had become a mere cipher. Every responsibility fell on Mrs. Raby, and she, eager to do right and fearful to do wrong, struggled with her better nature, wavered, repented, and yet remained inactive. Neville strongly reprobated the conduct of everyone towards Elizabeth. He had never seen Mrs. Raby, but she in particular he regarded with the strongest disapprobation. It so happened that, the very day after his father's death, he was at Lady Cecil's when Mrs. Raby called, and by an exception in the general orders made for Elizabeth's sake, she was let come up. Gerard was alone in the drawing-room when she was announced. He rose hastily, meaning to withdraw, when the lady's appearance changed his entire mind. We ridicule the minutiae of the science of physiognomy, but who is not open to first impressions? Neville was prepossessed favorably by Mrs. Raby's countenance, her open, thoughtful brow, her large, dark, melancholy eyes, her dignity of manner, joined to evident marks of strong feeling, at once showed him that he saw a woman capable of generous sentiments and heroic sacrifice. He felt that there must have been some grievous error in Sophia's proceedings not to have awakened more active interest in her mind. While he was forming these conclusions, Mrs. Raby was struck by him in an equally favorable manner. No one could see Gerald Neville without feeling that something angelic, something nobly disinterested, unearthly in its purity, yet beyond the usual nature of man, sympathetic, animated a countenance that was all sensibility, genius, and love. In a minute they were intimate friends. Lady Cecil, hearing that they were together, would not interrupt them, and their conversation was long. Neville related his first acquaintance with Elizabeth Raby. He sketched the history of Falkner. He described him, and the scene when he denounced himself as the destroyer of Alethea. He declared his conviction of his innocence. He narrated Sir Boyville's dying words. Then they both dwelt on his long imprisonment, Elizabeth's faithful affection, and all that they must have undergone, enough to move the stoniest heart. Tears rushed into Gerard's eyes while he spoke, while he described her innocence, her integrity, her total forgetfulness of self. "And I have deserted her!" exclaimed Mrs. Raby. "We have all deserted her. This must not continue. You go to Carlisle tomorrow for the trial. The moment it is over, and Mr. Falkner acquitted, when they have left that town, where all is so full of their name and story, I will see her, and try to make up for my past neglect." "It will be too late," said Gerard. "You may then please yourself by admiring one so superior to every human being, but you will not benefit her. Falkner acquitted, she will have risen above all need of your support. Now is the hour to be of use, the very hour of the trial, when this unfortunate heroic girl is thrown entirely on herself, wounded by her absolute friendlessness, yet disdaining to complain. I could almost wish that Sophia would disregard appearances and hasten to her side, although her connection with our family would render that too strange. But you, Mrs. Raby, what should stop you? She is your niece. How vain to attempt to conceal this from the world! It must be known, through me, I fondly trust. It will be known. Who shall claim her as Miss Raby, when, as Elizabeth Falkner, I could never see her more? And when it is known, will not your desertion be censured? Be wise, be generous, win that noblest and gentlest heart by your kindness now, and the very act will be your reward. Hasten to Carlisle, be with her in the saddest hour that ever one so young and innocent passed through." Mrs. Raby was moved. She was persuaded. She felt a veil fall from before her eyes. She saw her duty, and she keenly felt the littleness of her past desertion. She did not hesitate. And now that she perceived how gladly her niece welcomed her in this hour of affliction, and how gratefully she appreciated her kindness, she found in the approval of her own heart the sweetest recompense for her disinterestedness. Elizabeth's swollen eyes and timid, hurried manner betrayed how she had passed the night, and how she was possessed by the most agitating fears. Still she spoke of the acquittal of her father, as she took pride in calling him at this crisis as certain; and Mrs. Raby, taking advantage of this, endeavored to draw her mind from the torture of representing to herself the progress of the scene then acting at so short a distance from them, by speaking of the future. Elizabeth mentioned Falkner's determination to quit England, and her own to accompany him. The hinted dissuasion of Mrs. Raby she disregarded. "He has been a father to me. I am his child. What would you say to a daughter who deserted her father in adversity and sickness? And, dear Mrs. Raby, you must remember that my father is, in spite of all his courage, struck by disease. Accustomed to my attentions, he would die if left to hirelings. Deserted by me, he would sink into apathy or despair." Mrs. Raby listened. She admired the enthusiasm, and yet the softness, the sensibility, and firmness of her young kinswoman. But she was pained. Many ideas assailed her, but she would not entertain them. They were too wild and dangerous. And yet her heart, formed for generosity, was tempted to trample upon the suggestions of prudence and the qualms of bigotry. To give diversion to her thoughts, she mentioned Gerald Neville. A blush of pleasure, a smile shone more in the eyes than on the lips, mantled over her niece's countenance. She spoke of him as of a being scarcely earthly in his excellence. His devotion to his mother first, and lately his generosity towards her, his resolution to go to America, to seek Osborne, for her sake and the sake of justice, were themes for eloquence. She spoke with warmth and truth. "Yet, if you follow Mr. Falkner's fortune," said Mrs. Raby, "you will see him no more." "I cannot believe that," replied Elizabeth. "Yet, if it must be so, I am resigned. He will never forget me, and I shall feel that I am worthy of him, though separated. Better that than to remain at the sacrifice of all I hold honorable and good. He would despise me, and that were a worse absence, an absence of the heart 10,000 times more galling than mere distance of place. One would be eternal and irremediable, the other easily obviated when our duties should no longer clash. I go with my father because he is suffering. Neville may join us because he is innocent. He will not, I feel and know, either forget me or stay away forever." End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of Falkner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Falkner by Mary Shelley. Chapter 50. While they were conversing, quick footsteps were heard in the street below. Mrs. Raby had succeeded in making the time pass more lightly than could be hoped. It was 3 o'clock. There was a knock at the door of the house. Elizabeth, breaking off abruptly, turned ashy pale, and clasped her hands in the agony of expectation. Osborne rushed into the room. "It is all over!" he exclaimed. "All is well!" Tears streamed from his eyes as he spoke, and ran up to shake hands with Elizabeth and congratulate her, with an ardor and joy that contrasted strangely with the frightened-looking being he had always before shown himself. "Mr. Falkner is acquitted. He is free. He will soon be here. No one could doubt his innocence that saw him. No one did doubt it. The jury did not even retire." Thus Osborne ran on, relating the events of the trial. Falkner's mere appearance had prepossessed everyone. The frankness of his open brow, his dignified, unembarrassed manner, his voice, whose clear tones were the very echo of truth, vouched for him. The barrister who conducted the prosecution narrated the facts rather as a mystery to be inquired into than as a crime to be detected. Gerald Neville's testimony was entirely favorable to the prisoner. He showed how Falkner, wholly unsuspected, safe from the shadow of accusation, had spontaneously related the unhappy part he took in his unfortunate mother's death, for the sake of restoring her reputation and relieving the minds of her relatives. The narrative, written in Greece and left as explanation in case of his death, was further proof of the truth of his account. Gerard declared himself satisfied of his innocence, and when he stated his father's dying words, his desire, at the last hour on the bed of death, to record his belief in Falkner's being guiltless of the charge brought against him, words spoken as it were yesterday, for he who uttered them still lay unburied. The surprise seemed to be that he should have suffered a long imprisonment and the degradation of a trial. Osborne's own evidence was clear and satisfactory. At last Falkner himself was asked what defense he had to make. As he rose, every eye turned on him, every voice and breath were hushed. A solemn silence reigned. His words were few, spoken calmly and impressively. He rested his innocence on the very evidence brought against him. He had been the cause of the lady's death, and asked for no mercy. But for her sake, and the sake of that heroic feeling that led her to encounter death amid the waves, he asked for justice, and he did not for a moment doubt that it would be rendered him. "Nor could you doubt it, as you heard him," continued Osborne. "Never were truth and innocence written so clearly on human countenance as on his, as he looked upon the jury with his eagle eyes, addressing them without pride, but with infinite majesty, as if he could rule their souls through the power of a clear conscience and a just cause. They did not hesitate. The jury did not hesitate a moment. I rushed here the moment I heard the words, and now he is come." Many steps were again heard in the street below, and one, which Elizabeth could not mistake, upon the stairs. Falkner entered. She flew to his arms, and he pressed her to his bosom, wrapping her in a fond, long embrace, while neither uttered a word. A few moments of trembling, almost to agony, a few agitated tears, and the natural gladness of the hour assumed its genuine aspect. Falkner, commanding himself, could shake hands with Osborne and thank him, and Elizabeth presented him to Mrs. Raby. He at once comprehended the kindness of her visit, and acknowledged it with a heartfelt thankfulness that showed how much he had suffered while picturing Elizabeth's abandonment. Soon various other persons poured into the room, and it was necessary to pass through many congratulations, and to thank, and what was really painful, to listen to the outpouring talk of those persons who had been present at the trial. Yet, at such a moment, the heart, warmed and open, acknowledges few distinctions. Among those whose evident joy in the result filled Elizabeth with gratitude, she and Falkner felt touched by none so much as the visit of a turnkey, who was ashamed to show himself, yet who, hearing they were immediately to quit Carlisle, begged permission to see them once again. The poor fellow, who looked on Elizabeth as an angel and Falkner as a demigod, for, not forgetting others in their adversity, they had discovered and assisted his necessities. The poor fellow seemed out of his mind with joy. Ecstasy was painted on his face. There was no mistaking the clear language of a full and grateful heart. At length the hurry and tumult subsided. All departed. Falkner and his beloved companion were left alone, and for a few short hours enjoyed a satisfaction so perfect that angels might have envied them. Falkner was humbled, it is true, and looked to the past with the same remorse, But in vain did he think that his pride ought to feel deeply wounded by the scene of that day. In vain did he tell himself that, after such a trial, the purity of his honor was tarnished. His heart told another tale. Its emphatic emotions banished every conventional or sophisticated regret. He was honestly though calmly glad, and acknowledged the homely feeling with the sincerity of a man who had never been nourished in false refinements or factitious woes. In the evening, when it was dusk, said Falkner, "Let us, love, take a walk." The words made Elizabeth both laugh and cry for joy. He put on his hat, and with her on his arm they got quickly out of the town and strolled down a neighboring lane. The wind that waved the heads of the still leafless trees, the aspect of the starry sky, the widespread fields, were felt as blessings from heaven by the liberated prisoner. "They all seem," he said, "created purely for my enjoyment. How sweet is nature! How divine a thing is liberty! Oh, my God! I dare not be so happy as I would. There is one thought to chill the genial glow. But for the image of lost dead Alethea, I should enjoy a felicity too pure for frail humanity." As they returned into the town, a carriage with 4 posters passed them. Elizabeth recognized at once Gerald Neville within. A pang shot through her heart to remember that they did not share their feelings, but were separated, perhaps forever, at this very hour. On her return, worn out with fatigue and oppressed with this reflection, she bade good night to Falkner, and he, happy in the idea that the same roof would cover them, kissed and embraced her. On entering her room she found a letter on her toilette, and smiles again dimpled her face. It was a letter from Neville. It contained a few words, a very few, of congratulation, reminding her that he must hurry back to town for the melancholy task of his father's funeral, and imploring that neither she nor Falkner would determine on any immediate step. "I cannot penetrate the cloud in which we are enveloped," he said, "but I know that I ought not, that I cannot lose you. A little time, a little reflection, may show us how to accord our various duties with the great necessity of our not being separated. Be not rash, therefore, my own Elizabeth, nor let your friend be rash. Surely the worst is over, and we may be permitted at last to hate no more, and to be happy." Elizabeth kissed the letter and placed it beneath her pillow. That night she slept sweetly and well. Early in the morning Mrs. Raby called on them. The same prepossession which Gerard had felt in her favor as soon as he saw her had taken place in her on seeing Falkner. There is a sort of magnetism that draws like to like, and causes minds of fine and lofty tone to recognize each other when brought in contact. Mrs. Raby saw and acknowledged at once Falkner's superiority. Whatever his faults had been, they were winnowed away by adversity, and he was become at once the noblest and gentlest of human beings. Mrs. Raby had that touch of generosity in her own character that never permitted her to see merit without openly acknowledging and endeavoring to reward it. The first thought of the plan she now entertained she had cast away as impracticable, but it returned. The desire to give and to benefit, a natural growth in her heart, made her look on it with complacency. By degrees she dismissed the objections that presented themselves, and resolved to act upon it. We complain, she thought, of the barrenness of life, and the tediousness and faults of our fellow creatures. And when Providence brings before us 2 selected from the world as endowed with every admirable quality, we allow 1,000 unworthy considerations, which assume the voice of prudence, to exile us from them. Where can I find a man like Falkner, full of honor, sensibility, and talent? Where a girl like Elizabeth, who has proved herself to be the very type of virtuous fidelity? Such companions will teach my children better than volumes of moral treatises. the existence and loveliness of human goodness. Mrs. Raby passed a sleepless night, revolving these thoughts. In the morning she called on her new friends, and then, with all the grace that was her peculiar charm, she invited them to accompany her to Belforest, and to take up their residence there for the next few months. Elizabeth's eyes sparkled with delight. Falkner at once accepted the invitation for her, and declined it for himself. "You hear him, my dear aunt," cried Elizabeth, "but you will not accept his refusal. You will not permit this perversity." "You forget many things when you speak thus," said Falkner, "but Mrs. Raby remembers them all. I thank her for her kindness, but I am sure she will admit of the propriety of my declining her invitation." "You imagine, then," replied Mrs. Raby, "that I made it for form's sake, intending it should be refused. You mistake. I know what you mean, and all you would covertly suggest. Let us cast aside the ceremonies of mere acquaintanceship. Let us be friends, and speak with the openness natural to us. Do you consent to this?" "You are good, very good," said Falkner. "Except this dear girl, who will deign to be my friend?" "If I thought," replied Mrs. Raby, "that your heart was so narrowed by the disasters and injustice you have suffered, that you must hereafter shut yourself up with the remembrance of them, I should feel inclined to retract my offer, for friendship is a mutual feeling, and he who feels only for himself can be no one's friend. But this is not the case with you. You have a heart true to every touch of sympathy, as Elizabeth can testify, since you determined to live for her sake when driven to die by the agony of your sufferings. Let us then at once dismiss notions which I must consider as unworthy of us. When we turn to the page of history and read of men visited by adversity, what do we say to those of their fellow creatures who fall off from them on account of their misfortunes? Do we not call them little-minded, and visit them with our contempt? Do not class me with such. I might pass you carelessly by, if you had always been prosperous. It is your misfortunes that inspire me with friendship, that render me eager to cultivate an intimacy with one who has risen above the most frightful calamity that could befall a man, and shown himself at once repentant and courageous. You will understand what I mean without long explanation. We shall have time for that hereafter. I honor you. What my heart feels, my voice and actions will ever be ready to proclaim. For Elizabeth's sake, you must not permit the world to think that he who adopted and brought her up is unworthy of regard and esteem. Come with us to Belforest, you must not refuse. I long to introduce my girls to their matchless cousin. I long to win her heart by my affection and kindness. And if you will permit me the enviable task, how proud and glad I shall be to repay a portion of what we owe you on her account, by endeavoring to compensate by a few months of tranquillity and friendship for the misery you have undergone." Mrs. Raby spoke with sincerity and earnestness, and Elizabeth's eyes pleaded her cause yet more eloquently. "Where you go," she said to Falkner, "there also I shall be. I shall not repine, however you decide, but we shall be very happy at Belforest." It was real modesty and no false pride that actuated Falkner. He felt happy, yet when he looked outward, he fancied that hereafter he must be shut out from society, a branded man. He intimately felt the injustice of this. He accepted it as a punishment for the past, but he did not the less proudly rise above it. It was a real pleasure to find one entertaining the generous sentiments which Mrs. Raby expressed, and capable of acting on them. He felt worthy of her regard, and acknowledged that none but conventional reasons placed any barrier to his accepting her kind offers. Why, then, should he reject them? He did not. Frankly and with sincere thanks, he suffered himself to be overruled, and on the following day they were on their road to Belforest. End of chapter 50. Chapter 51 of Falkner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Falkner by Mary Shelley. Chapter 51. It was one of those days which do sometimes occur in March, warm and balmy and enlivening as spring always is. The birds were busy among the leafless boughs, and if the carriage stopped for a moment, the gushing song of the skylark attracted the eye to his blue ethereal bower. A joyous welcome was breathed by nature to every heart, and none answered it so fervently as Falkner. Sentiments of pleasure possessed all three travelers. Mrs. Raby experienced that exultation natural to all human beings when performing a generous action. Elizabeth felt that in going to Belforest she drew nearer Neville, for there was no reason why he should not enter her grandfather's doors. But Falkner was happier than either. It was not the vulgar joy of having escaped danger. Partly it was gladness to see Elizabeth restored to her family, where only as things were she could find happiness, and yet not divided from him. Partly it arose from the relief he felt as the burden of heavy, long-endured care was lifted from his soul. But there was something more, which was incomprehensible even to himself. His bosom's lord sat lightly on its throne. He no longer turned a saddened, reproachful eye on nature, nor any more banished soft emotions, nourishing remorse as a duty. He was reconciled to himself and the world. The very circumstances of his prison and his trial being over, took with them the more galling portion of his retrospections. Health again filled his veins. At the moment when he had first accused himself, Neville saw in him a man about to die. It was evident now that the seeds of disease were destroyed. His person grew erect, his eye clear and animated. Elizabeth had never, since they left Greece, seen him so free from suffering. During all her intercourse with him, she never remembered him so bland and cheerful in his mood. It was the reward of much suffering, the gift of heaven to one who had endured patiently, opening his heart to the affections instead of cherishing pride and despair. It was the natural result of a noble disposition which could raise itself above even its own errors, throwing off former evil as alien to its nature, embracing good as its indefeasible right. They entered the majestic avenues and embowered glades of Belforest, where cedar, larch, and pine diversified the bare woods with a show of foliage. The turf was covered with early flowers. The buds were green and bursting on the boughs. Falkner remembered his visit the preceding summer. How little had he then foreseen impending events, and how far from his heart had then been the peace that at present so unaccountably possessed it. Then the wide demesne and stately mansion had appeared the abode of gloom and bigotry. Now it was changed to a happy valley where love and cheerfulness reigned. Mrs. Raby was welcomed by her children, 2 elegant girls of 15 and 16, and a spirited boy of 12. They adored their mother, and saw in their new cousin an occasion for rejoicing. Their sparkling looks and gay voices dispelled the last remnant of melancholy from the venerable mansion. Old Oswey Raby himself, too much sunk in dotage to understand what was going on, yet smiled and looked glad on the merry faces about him. He could not exactly make out who Elizabeth was. He was sure that it was a relation, and he treated her with an obsequious respect, which, considering his former impertinent tone, was exceedingly amusing. What was wanting to complete the universal happiness? Elizabeth's spirits rose to unwonted gaiety in the society of her young relations, and her cousin Edwin in particular found her the most delightful companion in the world, for she was as fearless on horseback as himself, and was unwearied in amusing him by accounts of the foreign countries she had seen, and adventures, ridiculous or fearful, that she had encountered. In Mrs. Raby she found a beloved friend for serious hours, and Falkner's recovered health and spirits were a source of exhaustless congratulation. Yet where was Gerald Neville? Where the looks of love and rapturous sense of sympathy, before which all the other joys of life fade into dimness? Love causes us to get more rid of our haunting identity, and to give ourselves more entirely away than any other emotion. It is the most complete, the most without veil or shadow to mar its beauty. Every other human passion occupies but a distinct portion of our being. This assimilates with all, and turns the whole into bliss or misery. Elizabeth did not fear that Gerard would forget her. He had remembered through the dark hours gone by, and now his shadow walked with her beneath the avenues of Bell Forest, and the recollection of his love impregnated the balmy airs of spring with a sweetness unfelt before. Elizabeth had now leisure to love, and many an hour she spent in solitary yet blissful dreams, almost wondering that such happiness was to be found on earth. What a change, what a contrast between the death-girt prison of Carlisle and the love-adorned glades of her ancestral park! Not long ago the sky appeared to bend over one universe of tears and woe, and now in the midst a piece of heaven had dropped down upon earth, and she had entered the enchanted ground. Yet, as weeks sped on, some thoughts troubled her repose. Gerard neither came nor wrote. At length she got a letter from Lady Cecil, congratulating her on Falkner's acquittal, and the kindness of her aunt. Her letter was amiable, yet it was constrained. And Elizabeth, reading it again and again, and pondering on every expression, became aware that her friends felt less satisfaction than she did in the turn of fortune that placed her and Falkner together under her paternal roof. She had believed that, as Elizabeth Raby, Neville would at once claim her. But she was forced to recollect that Falkner was still at her side, and what intercourse could there be between him and his mother's destroyer? Thus anxiety and sadness penetrated poor Elizabeth's new-found paradise. She strove to appear the same, but she stole away when she could, to meditate alone on her strange lot. It doubled her regret to think that Neville also was unhappy. She figured the struggles he underwent. She almost thought that, if he were happy, she could bear all. She remembered him as she last saw him, agitated and wretched. She alone, she felt sure, could calm, she alone minister happiness. And were they never more to meet? Falkner, who watched Elizabeth with all the jealousy of excessive affection, soon perceived the change. At first her gaiety had been spontaneous, her step free, her voice and laugh the very echo of joy. Now the forced smile, the frequent abstraction, the eagerness with which she watched for opportunities to steal into solitude, while her attentions to him became even more sedulous and tender, as if she wished to prove how ready she was to make every sacrifice for his sake. All these appearances he saw, and his heart ached to think how the effects of his errors still spread poison over his own life and that of one so dear. He felt sure that Mrs. Raby shared his uneasiness. She and her niece were much less together than before. Elizabeth could not speak of the thoughts that occupied her, and she could not feign with her dear wise friend, whose eyes read her soul, and whose counsels or consolations she alike feared. Falkner saw Mrs. Raby's regards fix anxiously on her young relative. He penetrated her thoughts, and again he was forced to abhor himself as the destroyer of the happiness of all who came within his sphere. It was evident that some communication must take place between some one of the individuals thus misplaced and wretched. Elizabeth alone was resigned, and therefore silent. Falkner longed to act rather than to speak, to depart, to disappear forever. He also, therefore, brooded mutely over the state of things. Mrs. Raby, seeing the wretchedness that was creeping over the hearts of those whose happiness she most desired, was the first to enter on the subject. One day, being alone with Falkner, she began: "The more I see and admire my dearest niece," she said, "the greater I feel our obligation to be to you, Mr. Falkner, for having made her what she is. Her natural disposition is full of excellence, but it is the care and the education you bestowed which give her character so high a tone. Had she come to us in her childhood, it is more than probable she would have been placed in a convent. And what nature, however perfect, but would be injured by the system that reigns in those places? To you we owe our fairest flower, and if gratitude could repay you, you would be repaid by mine. To prove it and to serve you must always be the most pleasing duty of my life." "I should be much happier," said Falkner, "if I could regard my interference as you do. I fear I have injured irreparably my beloved girl, and that, through me, she is suffering pangs which she is too good to acknowledge, but which in the end may destroy her. Had I restored her to you, had she been brought up here, she and Gerald Neville would not now be separated." "But they might never have met," replied Mrs. Raby. "It is indeed vain thus to regard the past. Not only is it unalterable, but each link of the chain, producing the one that followed, seems, in our instance, to have been formed and riveted by a superior power for peculiar purposes. The whole order of events is inscrutable. One little change, and none of us would be as we are now. Except as a lesson or a warning, we ought not to contemplate the past, but the future certainly demands our attention. It is impossible to see Gerald Neville and not to feel an intense interest in him. He is worthy of our Elizabeth, and he is ardently attached to her, and has, besides, made a deep impression on her young heart, which I would not have erased or lessened. For I am sure that her happiness, as far as mortals can be happy, will be ensured by their marriage." "I stand in the way of this union, of that I am well aware," said Falkner. "But be assured I will not continue to be an obstacle to the welfare of my angel girl. It is for this that I would consult you. How are contradictions to be reconciled? Or rather, how can we contrive my absence so as to remove every impediment, and yet not to awaken Elizabeth's suspicions?" "I dislike contrivances," replied Mrs. Raby, "and I hate all mystery. Suffer me, therefore, to speak frankly to you. I have often conversed with Elizabeth. She is firm not to marry, so as to be wholly divided from you. She reasons calmly, but she never wavers. She will not, she says, commence new duties by, in the first place, betraying her old ones. She should be forever miserable if she did, and therefore those who love her must not ask it. Sir Gerard entertains similar sentiments with regard to himself, though less resolute, and, I believe, less just than hers. I received a letter from him this morning. I was pondering whether to show it to you or to my niece. It seems to me best that you should read it, if it will not annoy you." "Give it me," said Falkner, "and permit me also to answer it. It is not in my nature to dally with evils. I shall meet those that now present themselves, and bring the best remedy I can, at whatever cost." Neville's letter was that of a man whose wishes were at war with his principles, and yet who was not convinced of the justice of the application of those principles. It began by deeply regretting the estrangement of Elizabeth from his family, by asking Mrs. Raby if she thought that she could not be induced to pay another visit to Lady Cecil. He said that that lady was eager to see her, and only delayed asking her till she ascertained whether her friendship, which was warm and lively as ever, would prove as acceptable as formerly. "I will at once be frank with you," the letter continued, "for your excellent understanding may direct us, and will suggest excuses for our doubts. You may easily divine the cause of our perplexities, though you can scarcely comprehend the extreme painful nature of mine. Permit me to treat you as a friend. Be the judge of my cause. I have faith in the purity and uprightness of a woman's heart, when she is endowed with gifts such as you possess. I had once thought to refer myself to Miss Raby herself, but I dread the generous devotedness of her disposition. Will you, who love her, take therefore the task of decision on yourself? Neville went on to express, in few but forcible words, his attachment to Elizabeth, his conviction that it could never change, and his persuasion that she returned it. "It is not therefore my cause merely that I plead," he said, "but hers also. Do not call me presumptuous for thus expressing myself. A mutual attachment alone can justify extraordinary conduct, but where it is mutual, every minor consideration ought to give way before it. The happiness of both our lives depends upon our not trifling with feelings which I am sure can never change. They may be the source of perpetual felicity. If not, they will. They must be pregnant with misery to the end of our lives. But why this sort of explanation, when the meaning that I desire to convey is, that if, that as, may I not say, we love each other, no earthly power shall deprive me of her. Sooner or later she shall be mine. And meanwhile this continued separation is painful beyond my fortitude to bear. Can I take my mother's destroyer by the hand, and live with him on terms of intimacy and friendship? Such is the price I must pay for Elizabeth. May I so far forget the world's censure, and, I may say, the instigations of nature, as unreservedly to forgive? I will confess to you, dear Mrs. Raby, that when I saw Falkner in the most degraded situation in which a man can be placed, manacled, and as a felon, his dignity of mien, his majestic superiority to all the race of common mortals around, the grandeur of his calm yet piercing eye, and the sensibility of his voice, won my admiration. With such is peopled that heaven, where the noble penitent is more welcome than the dull follower of a narrow code of morals, who never erred because he never felt. I pardon him, then, from my heart, in my mother's name. These sentiments, the entire forgiveness of the injury done me, and the sense of his merits still continue. But may I act on them? Would not you despise me if I did? Say but that you would, and my sentence is pronounced. I lose Elizabeth. I quit England forever. It matters little where I go. Yet, before you decide, consider that this man possesses virtues of the highest order. He honored as much as he loved my mother, and if his act was criminal, dearly has he paid the result. I persuade myself that there is more real sympathy between me and my mother's childhood friend, who loved her so long and truly, whose very crime was a mad excess of love, than one who knew nothing of her, to whom her name conjures up no memories, no regret. I feel that I could lament with Falkner the miserable catastrophe, and yet not curse him for bringing it about. Nay, as with such a man there can be no half sentiments. I feel that if we are thrown together, his noble qualities will win ardent sentiments of friendship. Were not his victim my mother, there does not exist a man whose good opinion I should so eagerly seek and highly prize as that of Rupert Falkner. It is that fatal name which forms the barrier between me and charity, shutting me out at the same time from hope and love. Thus incoherently I put down my thoughts as they rise, a tangled maze which I ask you to unravel. I will endeavor to abide by your decision, whatever it may be. Yet I again ask you to pause. Is Elizabeth's happiness as deeply implicated as mine? If it be, can I abide by any sentence that shall condemn her to a wretchedness similar to that which has so long been an inmate of my struggling heart? No. Sooner than inflict one pang on her, I will fly from the world, We three will seek some far obscure retreat, and be happy despite the world's censure and even your condemnation." Falkner's heart swelled within him as he read. He could not but admire Neville's candor, and he was touched by the feelings he expressed towards himself. But pride was stronger than regret, and prompted an instant and decisive reply. He rebelled against the idea that Gerard and Elizabeth should suffer through him, and thus he wrote: "You have appealed to Mrs. Raby. Will you suffer me to answer that appeal and to decide? I have a better right, for kind as she is, I have Elizabeth's welfare yet more warmly at heart. The affection that she feels for you will endure to the end of her life, for her faithful heart is incapable of change. On you, therefore, depends her happiness, and you are called upon to make some sacrifice to ensure it. Come here, take her at my hand. It is all I ask. From that hour you shall never see me more. The injured and the injurer will separate. My fortunes are of my own earning, and I can bear them. You must compensate to my dear child for my loss. You must be father as well as husband, and speak kindly of me to her, or her heart will break. We must be secret in our proceedings. Mystery and deception are contrary to my nature, but I willingly adopt them for her sake. Mrs. Raby must not be trusted. But you and I love Elizabeth sufficiently even to sacrifice a portion of our integrity to secure her happiness. For her own sake we must blindfold her. She need never learn that we deceived her. She will naturally be separated from me for a short time. The period will be indefinitely prolonged, till new duties arise wholly to wean her from me, and I shall be forgotten. Come then at once. Endure the sight of the guilty Falkner for a few short days, till you thus earn his dearest treasure. And do not fear that I shall intrude one moment longer than is absolutely necessary for our success. Be assured that when once Elizabeth is irrevocably yours, wide seas shall roll between us. Nor will your condescension to my wish bring any stigma on yourself or your bride, for Miss Raby does not bear my tainted name. All I ask is that you will not delay. It is difficult for me to cloak my feelings to one so dear. Let my task of deception be abridged as much as possible. I shall give my Elizabeth to you with confidence and pleasure. You deserve her. Your generous disposition will enable you to endure her affection for me, and even her grief at my departure. Never speak unkindly of me to her. When you see me no more, you will find less difficulty in forgetting the injury I have done you. You must endeavor to remember only the benefit you receive in gaining Elizabeth. End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of Falkner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Falkner by Mary Shelley. Chapter 52. The beautiful month of May had arrived, with her light budding foliage, which seems to hang over the hoar branches of the trees like a green aerial mist. The nightingales sung through the moonlight night, and every other feathered chorister took up the note at early dawn. The sweetest flowers in the year embroidered the fields, and the verdant cornfields were spread like a lake, now glittering in the sun, now covered over by the shadows of the clouds. It appeared impossible not to hope, not to enjoy. Yet a seriousness had again gathered over Falkner's countenance that denoted the return of care. He avoided the society even of Elizabeth. His rides were solitary, his evenings passed in the seclusion of his own room. Elizabeth, for the first time in her life, grew a little discontented. I sacrificed all to him, she thought, yet I cannot make him happy. Love alone possesses the scepter and arbitrary power to rule. Every other affection admits a parliament of thoughts, and debate and divisions ensue, which may make us wiser, but which sadly derogates from the throned state of what we fancy a master sentiment. I cannot make Falkner happy. Yet Neville is miserable through my endeavours, and to such struggle there is no end. My promised faith is inviolable, nor do I even wish to break it. One balmy, lovely day, Elizabeth rode out with her cousins. Mrs. Raby was driving her father-in-law through the grounds in the pony phaeton. Falkner had been out and was returned. Several days had passed, and no answer arrived from Neville. He was uneasy and sad, and yet rejoiced at the respite afforded to the final parting with his child. Suddenly, from the glass doors of the salon, he perceived a gentleman riding up the avenue. He recognized him and exclaimed, "All is over!" At that moment he felt himself transported to a distant land, surrounded by strangers, cut off from all he held dear. Such must be the consequence of the arrival of Gerald Neville, and it was he who, dismounting, in a few minutes after, entered the room. He came up to Falkner and held out his hand, saying, "We must be friends, Mr. Falkner. From this moment I trust that we are friends. We join together for the happiness of the dearest and most perfect being in the world." Falkner could not take his hand. His manner grew cold, but he readily replied, "I hope we do, and we must concert together to ensure our success." "Yet there is one other," continued Neville, "whom we must take into our consultations." "Mrs. Raby?" "No, Elizabeth herself. She alone can decide for us all, and teach us the right path to take. Do not mistake me. I know the road she will point out, and am ready to follow it. Do you think I could deceive her? Could I ask her to give me her dear self, and thus generously raise me to the very height of human happiness, with deception on my lips? I am indeed unworthy of her, if I were capable of such an act. Yet, but for the sake of honest truth, I would not even consult her. My own mind is made up, if you consent. I am come to you, Mr. Falkner, as a suppliant, to ask you to give me your adopted child, but not to separate you from her. I should detest myself if I were the cause of so much sorrow to either. If my conduct need explanation in the world, you are my excuse. I need go no further. We must both join in rendering Miss Raby happy, and both, I trust, remain friends to the end of our lives." "You are generous," replied Falkner. "Perhaps you are just. I am not unworthy of the friendship you offer, were you any other than you are. It is because I am such as I am that I venture to make advances which would be impertinent from any other." At this moment a light step was heard on the lawn without, and Elizabeth stood before them. She paused in utter wonder on seeing Falkner and Neville together. Soon surprise was replaced by undisguised delight. Her expressive countenance became radiant with happiness. Falkner addressed her. "I present a friend to you, dear Elizabeth. I leave you with him. He will best explain his purposes and wishes. Meanwhile, I must remark that I consider him bound by nothing that has been said. You must take counsel together. You must act for your mutual happiness. That is all the condition I make. I yield to no other. Be happy, and, if it be necessary, forget me, as I am very willing to forget myself." Falkner left them, and they instinctively, so to prevent interruption, took their way into a woody glade of the park. And as they walked beneath the shadows of some beautiful lime trees, on the crisp green turf, disclosed to each other every inner thought and feeling. Neville declared his resolve not to separate her from her benefactor. "If the world censure me," he said, "I am content. I am accustomed to its judgments, and never found them sway or annoy me. I do right for my own heart. It is a godlike task to reward the penitent. In religion and morality I know that I am justified. Whether I am in the code of worldly honor, I leave others to decide. And yet I believe that I am. I had once thought to have met Falkner in a duel, but my father's vengeance prevented that. He is now acquitted before all the world of being more than the accidental cause of my dear mother's death. Knights of old, after they fought in right good earnest, became friends, each finding in the bravery of the other a cause for esteem. Such is the situation of Rupert Falkner and myself. And we will both join, dear Elizabeth, in making him forget the past and rendering his future years calm and happy. Elizabeth could only look her gratitude. She felt, as was most true, that this was not a cause for words or reason. Falkner in himself offered, or did not offer, full excuse for the generosity of Neville. No one could see him and not allow that the affectionate, duteous son in no way derogated from his reverence for his mother's memory by entirely forgiving him who honored her as an earthly angel, and had deplored through years of unutterable anguish the mortal injury done her. Satisfied in his own mind that he acted rightly, Neville did not seek for any other approval. And yet he gladly accepted it from Elizabeth, whose heart, touched to its very core by his nobleness, felt an almost painful weight of gratitude and love. She tried to express it. Fortunately, between lovers, mere language is not necessary ineffectually to utter that which transcends all expression. Neville felt himself most sweetly thanked. A more happy pair never trod this lovely earth than the two that, closely linked hand in hand, and with hearts open and true as the sunlight about them, enjoyed the sweetest hour of love, the first of acknowledged perpetual union, beneath the majestic deep-shadowing thickets of Belforest. All that had seemed so difficult now took its course easily. They did not any of them seek to account for or to justify the course they took. They each knew that they could not do other than they did. Elizabeth could not break faith with Falkner. Neville could not renounce her. It might be strange, but it must be so. They three must remain together through life, despite all of tragic and miserable that seemed to separate them. Even Lady Cecil admitted that there was no choice. Elizabeth must be won. She was too dear a treasure to be voluntarily renounced. In a few weeks, the wedding day of Sir Gerald Neville and Miss Raby being fixed, she joined them at Belforest, and saw with genuine pleasure the happiness of the two persons whom she esteemed and loved most in the world secured. Mrs. Raby's warm heart reaped its own reward in witnessing this felicitous conclusion of her interference. Whether the reader of this eventful tale will coincide with every other person, fully in the confidence of all, in the opinion that such was the necessary termination of a position full of difficulty, is hard to say. But so it was. And it is most certain that no woman who ever saw Rupert Falkner but thought Neville just and judicious. And if any man disputed this point, when he saw Elizabeth, he was an immediate convert. As much happiness as anyone can enjoy, whose inner mind bears the unhealing wound of a culpable act, fell to the portion of Falkner. He had repented, and was forgiven, we may believe, in heaven as well as on earth. He could not forgive himself, and this one shadow remained upon his lot. It could not be got rid of. Yet perhaps in the gratitude he felt to those about him, in the softened tenderness inspired by the sense that he was dealt with more leniently than he believed that he deserved, he found full compensation for the memories that made him feel himself a perpetual mourner beside Alethea's grave. Neville and Elizabeth had no drawback to their felicity. They cared not for the world, and when they did enter it, the merits of both commanded respect and liking. They were happy in each other, happy in a growing family, happy in Falkner, whom, as Neville had said, it was impossible to regard with lukewarm sentiments. And they derived a large store of happiness from his enlightened mind, from the elevated tone of moral feeling, which was the result of his sufferings, and from the deep affection with which he regarded them both. They were happy also in the wealth which gave scope to the benevolence of their dispositions, and in the talents that guided them rightly through the devious maze of life. They often visited Drawmore, but their chief time was spent at their seat in Bucks, near which Falkner had purchased a villa. He lived in retirement. He grew a sage amid his books and his own reflections. But his heart was true to itself to the end, and his pleasures were derived from the society of his beloved Elizabeth, of Neville, who was scarcely less dear, and their beautiful children. Surrounded by these, he felt no want of the nearest ties. They were to him as his own. Time passed lightly on, bringing no apparent change. Thus they still live, and Neville has never for a moment repented the irresistible impulse that led him to become the friend of him whose act had rendered his childhood miserable, but who completed the happiness of his maturer years. End of Chapter 52. End of Falkner by Mary Shelley.